Okay, so I believe this is live, so hopefully you can all hear me, you can all see me. I believe we're all started. So one thing I would just appreciate is if you could actually type into the chat if you can hear me, you can see me. What I see is a delay on my side, so it's a little bit different to what you see. So if you can hear me, there's probably a black background behind me, but just put into the chat if you can hear me okay. And once we have some confirmation, yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so people can actually see me, that's a good thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put up these slides behind me, and basically we're going to go through these slides. So these are everything that you need to know for the upcoming SCS exam. And I just want to, I suppose, tell you that I'm going to be looking at my phone, and it's not because I'm looking at WhatsApp or whatever. I'm going to monitor your questions using my phone. Okay, so I can basically go through this and I can check and see what questions you have without having to exit out of PowerPoint. So if you see me looking at my phone, that's what it's for. Okay, so I'm just going to go into my PowerPoints here, and what I will do is I'm just going to ask you if you can see this PowerPoint okay, and I'm going to just check my phone for the questions. And yeah, okay, cool. So I see all the questions coming through here. And so please let me know if you can see the PowerPoints, if they're clear. They should be pretty good quality. Okay, so if you don't have good quality on your side, please click on the settings button, and if you go into 1080p, you can actually see the live stream in a higher quality level. Okay, so if you click on the little cog and you go 1080p, you can see it at its highest quality level possible. If you have, let's say, for example, pixelation, you can just go into that setting. If your internet speeds are not that quick, then, you know, just go into 720 or whatever it is. Okay, so everyone can see, everyone can hear. Looks like we're good to go. So look, thanks so much for attending this session. Okay, it's a totally free session. At any point, if you want to drop out, you can. Okay, there's no obligations here. This isn't a big sales pitch or anything like that as well. So I know some providers like to put on these live events, and really they're just a sales pitch for their products. This is not necessarily the case. Of course, I'm happy if you want to buy my courses, if you want to buy my book for the SCS, you're more than welcome to do so. But this really is a session for everyone who is thinking of sitting the SCS exam and needs some additional information on what could be tested, what could actually come up within the exam. And as well, we're going to go through some exam technique. Okay, so if you see me looking to the side, I'm just looking at your questions. Okay, so I want to make sure that I'm answering your questions too while I go through this. So how I've planned this out is basically I'm going to go through each of the core activities. So if you've never sat a case study exam before, or if you're maybe new to the whole concept of case studies, basically the SCS exam is split up into 5 core activities, and that's how the syllabus is written. Okay, so basically we have core activity A, B, C, D, and E, and that forms the basis of the SCS. Okay, so it has its own unique syllabus. And basically, each of the core activities test different areas, okay? Now, it's important to note here that you're tested on all of the core activities, so they are represented within your paper to varying degrees, okay? And you don't know in advance what they will be, but you're going to be tested on all of these, okay? So it's important that we go through all of them. So what we're going to do, first and foremost, is we're going to look at, as I said, highly testable theory areas for rhodamine. So this is not a generic session. This is a proper session on what could come up for this particular paper. Based on my expertise, I've been teaching this for 7 years now. I've created content for multiple providers. I still create content for Cima. So I do have a general sense as to what could come up in this paper. But of course, just a word of warning, there's no guarantees here. Okay, so please don't come back and say, Hugh, you said this would come up and then I didn't actually come up. Okay, so this is, you know, to be taken with a pinch of salt. Now, it's really important here just to note that we have some references beside each of the theory areas we're going to look at, and some of these references may not make sense to you. Don't worry too much about them. These are actually references to the video lessons within the Pro Accountancy Ultimate SCS course. So you may see things like C2, E2. These are just references for videos that you can watch within the course. Okay, so you don't really need to worry too much about those, but if you have the course and maybe you're looking at this video, then you can just go and look at those videos if that's a theory area you want to know more information about. Okay, so what we're going to look at in this section is core activity A. Now, what is core activity A? Well, it's all about developing business strategy. Okay, so it's between 15 to 25% of your paper. To be honest with you, this is probably one of the easier core activities, not so bad, okay, so students tend to do quite well in this one. But within core activities, we have what's known as assessment outcomes, and basically this breaks up the core activity into smaller pieces. So we have, in this case, I can evaluate strategic options, digital or otherwise. I can recommend strategic decisions, digital or otherwise. I can evaluate potential acquisitions and divestment opportunities, and I can recommend responses to opportunities and threats arising from digital technologies. So it's all about digital technologies, evaluating strategies, and also acquisitions, divestments, and so on and so forth. Okay, so in this particular case for Rhodomine, I think acquisitions is a really important topic. And the reason why I say that is because within this company, we have various different entities. We have the various different mines. There's no mine within Portland itself. So we have different companies overseas, that kind of stuff. I think you could see maybe a theme where we look to acquire a different type of business. Could happen. We could actually end up divesting, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So the first area that I think is really important is evaluating acquisitions. Okay, so this is a really straightforward area. It tends to come up quite often in the SCS, and what we're typically asked in the SCS, and I think it's a pretty good question if you get it on your paper, if I'm being honest, is evaluate the arguments for and the arguments against an acquisition. Okay, so when you think about arguments for and against, let's say, for example, Rhodomine looks to acquire a sodium mine, okay? When you think about the arguments for, start thinking about things like synergies. Are there any synergies? So it tends to be the case that when you acquire a business, you can eliminate duplicated roles. So I used to work in a business before where it was a retail business, they acquired another retail business, and basically they got rid of the 2 finance directors and they just had 1. So that was a cost saving instantly. And you can pretty much do that with most businesses, if I'm being honest. So that's an argument for typically cost synergies, efficiency synergies, and so on and so forth. Other arguments for it, maybe diversification. Okay, so maybe diversifying, what the business is involved in. So if we acquire something like, let's say, a battery manufacturer, a sodium ion battery manufacturer, well, that's diversifying to a certain extent. Okay, you could also have, in terms of arguments against, if we're looking to purchase a lithium mine, that actually we're not diversifying, we're investing more in lithium, so we're more exposed to risk coming from that industry. Other arguments against may be related to the financing strategy that's mentioned within the scenario. And it's really important that when you are presented with the scenario that you use the information that's been given to you. That's the key to doing well in the SCS. So some other theory here that's important to be aware of, and actually this was tested quite recently, is resource audit. So carrying out a resource audit ahead of an acquisition. Okay, so do we have the resources necessary to carry out this acquisition? So when you're asked about resource audits, all you're really being asked is carrying out an assessment of the resources that we have to make this acquisition. So do we have the skills? Do we have the finances? Do we have the expertise? Do we have the IT systems? Do we have data? It depends on the nature of the acquisition, of course. Okay, post-acquisition issues. Okay, so here we have lots of different types of scenarios that could come up. So retention issues. So let's say, for example, Rhodomine acquires maybe a cybersecurity business. This happens a lot within the SCS exam. I don't really know why, to be honest. But sometimes the business will purchase a cybersecurity firm. And in that case, typically those types of companies are highly reliant on their staff. Okay, so they're highly reliant on knowledge, tacit knowledge, and so on and so forth. So when the staff leave, that's a huge risk, that's a huge issue that we need to manage. Okay, so you may be asked how we could manage this, how we could maybe salvage the situation if it actually does happen. IT systems, so this has come up before where we acquire a business and there's issues around linking the IT systems. Strategic shift, okay, so this could happen as well where maybe we purchase a business, the business is not so good, things can happen like that. And governance, and this is something we'll return back to when we go to core activity E. Okay, so I'm just looking here at the questions just in case any of them come in, okay? So the next is divestment, okay? So divestment is like the other side of acquisitions, and it's actually pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. It's only been tested a handful of times in the SCS. I think you could maybe get a scenario around divestment. Maybe we divest from a high-risk country, something like that. We're trying to exit a country that is creating lots of problems for Rhodomine. There could be various different scenarios around divestments. I'm not 100% certain, to be honest with you, but I think that maybe could be a potential scenario. So when we are typically examined on things like divestments, normally it's around the valuation of the divestment, what we do with the cash or the funds, and as well the strategic implications. So when we think of strategic implications, we think of long-term impacts, okay? So we could have a divestment of a business unit, so in this case maybe a mine, maybe the entire business. That's actually occurred before if Rhodomine is acquired by another business. I don't see this happening personally, but it could, of course, okay, so we can't say for certain, but within the SCS before, the actual business mentioned in the pre-scene was purchased by another business. So that has happened before in the past as well, and I think this is an interesting one. I think this could maybe be a potential question, is the acquisition or divestment of a stakeholder. So for example, if you have a customer like Rhodomine does, has a big customer that it's quite reliant on, what happens if that customer is purchased? Okay, so that could change the nature of the business. Maybe they purchase more from us, maybe they purchase less, who knows? Okay, it depends on the scenario. Now, the relevance when acquiring, so this has come up before. This was a bit of a weird question, okay? And the question basically said, what do we do, or should we care about this company being a divestment of another business? So that's basically what it was saying is, is this a relevant factor? Should it matter? And that type of question is quite interesting because it's not necessarily something that you may clearly see on the syllabus, okay? So it requires students to kind of use their critical thinking skills. And I think this type of question, I mean, it could come up, okay? I don't know for certain. But basically, when you're answering questions like this, you should say, in terms of if it's a divestment, yes, it's important because it could be the case that that business is being sold because it's not generating income, maybe there's risks associated with it, but also we need to consider the fact that actually maybe the parent company that's selling that company is looking to maybe move into other industries, and actually it may not necessarily be a bad thing. So that's how you do well in the SCS, is you create kind of a balanced argument, okay? You don't just kind of go with one perspective and say this is bad. Typically with the SCS you have to have kind of a weighted argument, and we'll see that as we go through some demo questions. Okay, so the next one then is creating subsidiaries. I don't see this being a hugely relevant topic for this particular pre-scene, but I think sometimes with the SCS, something that you think wouldn't be tested can be tested, okay? So creating subsidiaries is around, basically separating activities and putting them into a subsidiary. That has actually happened before where the business didn't have a subsidiary for a specific business unit, and there was a question about the difficulties in creating or separating out those activities and putting them into a self-contained subsidiary. So it's not really a question of IFRS or IAS standards or anything like that. Typically you get that at the MCS level. It was more about the difficulties in creating that subsidiary. So the question was really about spin-offs, okay? Now the next one has actually never occurred before, and the two are actually related here, so I'll just go through them together. Pre-bid defenses and post-bid defenses. So I think these are really easy to examine. One time I did examine them, okay, in mock papers years ago for a different provider, and students did really bad in the questions. So do be prepared for these types of questions where possibly there's a hostile takeover. Okay, so maybe there's a potential hostile takeover and we need to have pre-bid defenses. So an example of this would be the poison pill, and this is actually something that's used in the real world. So in the recent acquisition of Twitter, there was poison pills used, and basically this is where we have rights issues effectively, where they only activate when there's a certain threshold reached for a certain type of shareholder. Okay, so if we have the hostile takeover being done by a certain business, we can say, well, actually your rights, and the rights would normally be at a discount or sometimes at free, they would basically activate once there's a threshold reached by that hostile company. Okay, so that then leads to dilution. It's a negative thing. It basically prevents the acquisition, or it can make the acquisition more expensive. It can put off the acquisition. It can still happen, okay? So that's worth noting. And then post-bid defenses, so things like the Pac-Man defense, where basically you try to acquire the business that's trying to acquire you, okay? So that can happen as well. So these types of questions can come up where maybe you might have a hostile takeover. You might be asked, how could we defend ourselves? We can go to the competition authorities, all those types of things. They're pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. I think if Cima were to examine it, it would be a question where other students would do really bad in, if I'm being honest with you, okay? So it's a good one to know. This is a really testable topic here, the mission and the vision, and actually really straightforward, okay? So this has been examined over and over and over and over again, using the mission to evaluate strategies and using the vision to evaluate strategies, okay? And, kind of related to this, compliance with mission and vision. So you may be given a strategic decision, you may be given a acquisition, and you're asked, is this consistent with our mission? Is this consistent with our vision? And you may actually be examined on both. And to be honest with you, how you approach this question is try to think about a balanced argument. So in some cases, a strategy or an acquisition may be both in alignment and consistent, and maybe not, okay? So typically when you see the marking grids, it'll be split up into arguments for and against for these types of questions, okay? So a good idea is to try and think about, yes, it is to a certain extent, and no, it's not to a certain extent, okay? So it will depend on the nature of the decision, of course. It's also important to note here that for Rhodomine, its vision statement is huge, okay? So you can actually break up the vision into smaller pieces, and you can say, well, actually it's consistent with this piece, but it's not consistent with this piece. So the vision statement, for example, specifically mentions lithium. So if we look to acquire something like a sodium mine, you can say, well, the first part of it's fine, but the part about lithium, it's not consistent with that. So that's how you build a really, really good answer. Okay, that's what the markers are looking for. Okay, so another question that comes up every now and again is making adjustments. So making adjustments to the mission, making adjustments to the vision. This is something that is pretty straightforward. Okay, so there's a question maybe where we acquire another business. Let's say we purchase a sodium mine, or maybe we purchase a battery manufacturer, something like that. And there's a question as to whether we should adjust our mission statement and our vision statement in response to this. Okay, so should we change the mission? Okay, and really the answer will depend on the nature of the acquisition. It'll depend on the scenario, and this is something that you'll hear me say over and over in this stream. Okay, but generally speaking, again, it's a good idea to take a balanced approach. So you can say, yes, we should make an adjustment because the strategy is changing the nature of the business, but maybe we need to wait a little bit, maybe we need more information, maybe we need to see, is this something that we're going to progress with over the long term? It depends again. Okay, so we're going to look at a question on this soon enough. Okay, so values is another one, and it's related to the mission and the vision, to be honest with you. So you can also be examined on using values to evaluate a strategy. It's the same type of thing. Okay, so using mission, vision, values to evaluate a strategy. You may also have a question on adjusting the values. So this came up recently where there was bribery, and the question said, should we include information on bribery in our values? Okay, so weaker answers, basically what they will do is they will say, yeah, it's a good idea. Okay, so it tends to be the case that the really weak answers will say, yeah, the obvious, it's a good idea to add this into our values. Why wouldn't it be? Okay, it's a no-brainer. Bribery is a bad thing. But actually, if you think about it, right, if we add in something like that to our values, it may be seen as being performative. So if, for example, the business was accused of bribing someone or something like that, the markets may view this as just kind of like performative or a marketing exercise or so on and so forth. So we have to be conscious of that. It's a little bit more nuanced than just saying, yes, it's a good idea. Okay, so I see a question there. So a balanced approach is a safe bet. Yeah, it tends to be the case, to be honest with you. Okay, so generally speaking, the way the questions are written these days, they actually say arguments for and against, but years ago they used to actually specifically say that, and you would still have marking grids that would say you get marks for the arguments for and the arguments against. Okay, so I'm going to go through all your questions. If you just type in the questions, I'll go through it at the end of this core activity. Okay, so we have a few core activities to get through. I just want to make sure everyone gets all the information they need. But yes, good question actually. Okay, so the next is the influence over behavior. So what influence should values have over our behavior? Okay, so we have different core values. What's the extent of their usefulness, okay, in terms of guiding behavior? So this happened before where basically there was a series of errors in a game. Okay, so it was like a game manufacturer, and the question was saying, should our values have prevented this from occurring? And I actually think you could have a similar type question for rhodamine, where maybe there's an accident and the question says, actually, should our values have prevented that from occurring in the first place? And the answer here is actually pretty straightforward. Is yes, in theory it should, right? Because our values should inform the culture should therefore reflect safety and all these kind of things. However, they have limited usefulness because day to day operational level staff are not looking at a list of values. Now, let's just be realistic here. They're not looking at values saying, okay, I need to do this in alignment with values. And that's actually something that Cima wrote themselves in an answer. So you can be practical in your answers. You can use common sense. Okay, so again, we're using a weighted argument. We say, yes, it's important. Values do inform culture. They should have probably prevented this from occurring. However, they cannot guarantee that certain things are not going to occur. Okay, so we need to be balanced. Okay, so the next then is failing to comply with values. So should we have maybe ramifications for failing to comply with values and situations where maybe values are not being adhered to? So you could, kind of going back to this, and it's a similar example, is let's say, for example, we have an accident in one of the mines. What were the failures in the values there? Has that affected the situation? Should we update the values? Again, you can kind of see the questions coming up, okay? Now, the next one here is digital strategy. And I think this is quite an interesting one for rhodamine, okay? Because within the pre-scene, there's an article about cyber risk and automation is mentioned, but there really isn't much information about digital strategy and digital technology within this pre-scene, okay? And I think that leaves gaps for potentially, systems implementations or, maybe the use of new digital technology. That comes up every now and again. questions around the ecosystem. Okay, so this is like one of the most dreaded topics by all students, and actually I used to hate it as well. So I sat these papers like 7-8 years ago, and I used to hate ecosystems. I didn't really understand it. Basically, an ecosystem is just a collection of parties that deliver a product or service. In this particular case, when we think about the ecosystem of Rhodamine, who's involved? Well, basically, it's this company, Rhodamine, of course, the geologists, if we're maybe using geology services that are external to the business. Also, we have the government plays a role because they grant mining rights. We have the end customer. Okay, so in this case, it tends to be battery manufacturers, car manufacturers, and so on and so forth. We also have this futures market that's mentioned within the pre-scene. So that's also a part of this ecosystem. Okay, so when you're asked questions about evaluating a strategy's impact on the ecosystem, try and think about the different parties within that ecosystem, okay, and how they would be affected by this particular strategy, okay. And this is a question that's come up before in the past. The use of digital technology, so you could have a question, maybe, I don't know, okay, but there has been questions before in the past around the use of specific technologies, so things like cloud computing, so the risks of having, switching to cloud computing or something like that. These tend to be pretty straightforward questions because we all use these technologies to a certain extent, so really not the most difficult questions, okay? Now, this is a kind of a horrible question, to be honest with you. It came up before in the SCS, and it was, what is the benefit, or should the business engage in creating an explicit digital strategy? So what they were basically saying, Cima, is, should this business focus on creating a separate digital strategy, okay? And the answer here is actually pretty easy enough for Rhodamine if you know how to approach this. So if you think about Rhodamine, it doesn't have an IT director. It doesn't have a CTO, it doesn't have a CIO, it doesn't even have a director with any remit at all for IT. Okay, so it would be pretty difficult for the business to create a good digital strategy, effectively a well-informed one. Okay, so when we look at the pre-scene, we don't even see a technology department. So you could suggest that, and that's great application of the pre-scene. Okay, so that's something that you can incorporate within your answer. But you could say, actually, if we were to maybe recruit people, restructure the board, have a new board member, maybe it would be a good idea because it would drive a competitive advantage. Okay, so that kind of thing. Okay. The next is appointing digital leadership. So you could have questions around, appointing a CTO, appointing a CIO, taking on new board members with expertise in technology and automation and so on and so forth. That question has popped up a few times. Okay, so let's look at some potential questions here. This is a bit quicker, don't worry. So what we're going to do is we're going to just look at questions that could come up for these different areas, okay? So the first is acquisition. So evaluating the acquisition of a lithium mine, okay? That has to be like the most simple one. The next is a sodium mine, an electric vehicle manufacturer. Now these are just random ideas, but to be honest with you, Cima have come up with more bizarre ones in the past. A battery manufacturer, an AI firm, so maybe a firm that uses artificial intelligence to find different reserves of materials, metals, minerals, and so on and so forth. There is a real world company that actually does this that Bill Gates is invested in, so this could be something that could come up in your paper. A cybersecurity firm, this is like really popular with Cima. We have all different types of businesses just randomly acquiring cybersecurity firms. I don't know why, but they love testing that. Okay, so you could have a divestment question in your paper. What would that look like? So evaluating the acquisition of a divested mine owned by a competitor. So, is this a good idea? Basically acquiring a mine that has been divested by someone else. So yes, it may be because we don't have to, start it up. We don't have to get mining rights, but maybe it's being divested for a reason. Maybe it's in a high risk country. Maybe there's problems with it. Maybe it's loss making. Okay, so there's multiple factors to consider. Evaluating the effect of the sale of Rhodamine's largest customer. So we have this customer that's mentioned within the pre-scene. It's like one sentence, okay, it's tiny. But we have this really important customer. What happens if maybe they're sold to a big car manufacturer, okay, and maybe that car manufacturer looks to move away from electric vehicles, okay, and maybe they actually decide to invest more and actually create more demand for Rhodamine's products, and we become more entrenched with them, okay, so that could happen. Evaluating the impact of a compulsory sale as a result of government action. So this is a little bit more unique to Rhodamine, okay? So maybe we could have a situation where there's a bit of political instability. That's kind of suggested a little bit within the pre-scene. And then we're forced as a result of government action to sell one of our mines. This has actually happened before in Mexico, where Mexico created this nationalization plan for their lithium reserves. And as a result, some Chinese companies have had to sell their mines to this Mexican kind of, I don't know what you would call it, I suppose this semi-state body. that basically mines lithium on behalf of the state. Okay, so the mission and the vision. So evaluate if Rhodamine's vision should change as a result of the acquisition of a sodium mine or a sodium ion battery company. So again, the vision mentions lithium specifically, so we would have to evaluate if the vision should change as a result of this acquisition. Okay, so yes, it probably should. Okay, but you could say, well, actually there's components that should stay the same. Evaluate if an unrelated acquisition is consistent with Rhodamine's mission. So this has come up before, where basically we engage in an acquisition that's completely different to what we do, and it's not really in alignment with the mission. So you could say there's maybe some aspects that are in alignment, but we should never let that stop us from making a valuable acquisition that's going to generate shareholder value. So that's an important point you could have at the end of your answer. Just because it doesn't fully align with the mission doesn't mean that we shouldn't engage in it if it actually generates value, because we can always change the mission. Okay, it's not something that we should do all the time, but if it's a big acquisition and it's a good opportunity, then we can do that. Okay. Evaluate the argument that Rhodamine's mission is inconsistent with its impact. So I think this is an interesting question, and it could come up in your paper, where basically we're saying, Rhodamine's mission, is it not inconsistent with its impact to the environment? Okay, so maybe you could have a pressure group or a stakeholder or the government that suggests this, okay, and maybe you have a question where you have to evaluate this statement or this argument, okay? Values, so, evaluate whether values should have prevented an accident from occurring. That's something that we went through just a few minutes ago. Recommend whether values should be changed to reflect attitude to exploitation. So maybe there's, an investigation into one of the mines owned by Rhodamine, and actually there's worker exploitation going on, okay? So this is a theme that could come up. Not 100% certain again if it will, but this theme is very testable. There's lots of things that could come from it. So, whether values should be changed to reflect our, renewed attitude towards worker exploitation, where we're saying, actually, we really, really don't like this. And it's just like the bribery example, where it seems a little bit like a marketing ploy by just adding this into our values after something has happened, okay? The next one there, so recommend how Rhodamine could defend its values. So maybe we have, again, a pressure group, the government, stakeholders that question whether we're actually acting in alignment with our values. So we have to defend our values, okay? The next then, so evaluate the arguments for and against the appointment of a CTO, so a Chief Technology Officer or a Chief Information Officer. Could have that. Pretty straightforward question, to be honest with you. Evaluate the acquisition of an AI company in terms of its effect on the ecosystem. So maybe an AI company that's able to, based on the data that it gets from, let's say, satellites or geothermal data, that it's able to find different reserves of lithium or maybe other materials or, minerals or whatever it is. And basically, what effect that would have on the ecosystem. Okay, so if we think about it, it would probably put geologists in an awkward position. They'd have to probably change the nature of their job if it is an effective tool. As well, it would probably increase the amount of technology adoption within the overall industry. So if it generates a competitive advantage for Rhodamine, then other companies are going to use it as well. And that's likely to drive more technological adoption within the industry. The last one there, so recommend whether an explicit digital strategy is necessary for Rhodamine. That's something that we covered already. Okay, so let's go through a worked example, and after this example, I'll address your questions. Okay, so I can see a few of them coming through. So Rhodamine sustainability report's just been released, and it shows that the company's CO2 emissions and freshwater usage have increased for the third year. So one of Rhodamine's institutional shareholders publicly criticised the company in an article. The shareholder noted that the company has not been progressing with the achievement of its mission now for years, and perhaps that the mission should change to reflect this. Okay, so the question says, evaluate the argument that Rhodamine's mission should be adapted in response to shareholder criticism at its worth 50%. So this is the type of question that students would typically do pretty bad on, if I'm being honest, because the question is kind of awkward, okay? It's like, how do you even approach this, right? So like sometimes you have questions, they're like, evaluate the arguments for and against an acquisition. It's pretty straightforward. This type of question is probably not so nice, and that's why I've chosen it, okay? And this is one that just came from my head. So it's worth 50%. Now, I recommend that you have probably one paragraph for every 10% that's allocated to a subtask. So in this particular case, we'll likely have 5 paragraphs that probably do us pretty well, okay? So let's look at the argument. So the first argument is the validity of the argument. So we're actually going to take one side here, and then we're going to take the next side probably for the remaining paragraphs. So the first side that we're going to take is the side of the shareholders. So we're going to say, well, Rhodamine's mission is to power consumers' lives in a world that's clean, healthy and sustainable. So it's likely the case that within the question or in the reference materials, Cima would give you the mission, okay, but you always have the pre-seen as well. In the exam, you have a digital copy that you can go in and you can actually get the mission if you've forgotten it, okay? So don't worry too much about that piece. If Rhodamine's environmental performance is decreasing over time, then yes, it is true to a certain extent that its mission is not necessarily being achieved. And it could be argued that the shareholder therefore has a valid point, okay, so to a certain extent. If the mission is not going to be achieved, then maybe it's not actually relevant anymore and it needs to be adapted as a result. Now, let's look at the other arguments, and I think these are a little bit easier, to be honest. So, a mission statement sets out the fundamental purpose of an organization. It's meant to be ongoing, so it's not something that we just achieve in a year or two. And arguably, Rhodamine has actually been acting in alignment with the mission statement because its lithium is used in products that help to create a clean, healthy and sustainable world. So we're actually referencing the mission there. Okay, so this is what they call pre-seen application. Now, the overall environmental impact that we actually contribute to may not be captured in this particular case. So the fact that we're producing lithium that's used in electric vehicles, they're taking combustion engine vehicles off the road, that's probably not being captured in the sustainability report. So it's not necessarily true that our environmental performance is completely terrible over the last few years. Okay, so we need to take kind of a greater view on it. The timeline is important here as well. So, and this is using the information in the question. This is a classic case of using the scenario within your answer. So, Rhodamine's environmental performance has been declining over the last 3 years. However, environmental initiatives, they take time to implement. Okay, we all know this. This is like kind of common sense stuff, right? So, things like direct lithium extraction, they're still emerging as technologies in the real world. Okay, so this is where a bit of real world research would have come in handy. So it could be argued that a longer timeline of poor environmental results would actually warrant a change in the emission. But actually, 3 years is not really enough. Okay, so it's probably not enough amount of time to really say we should change the long-term goal of the organization. As well, and this is a really interesting one about the performance measures. So you can see here we have different paragraphs. We're raising different points in each one of these paragraphs. So if lithium extraction increases, the absolute amounts of freshwater usage and CO2 will increase, okay? And these are not necessarily proportional. So if we increase the amount of lithium that we're mining, these are going to increase, okay? So this is a raw measure of our sustainability performance. It's not proportional. It's not in proportion to the amount that we've produced. So it doesn't really give us a true reflection of our sustainability performance. And as a result, we could say, well, it's not really enough to warrant changing our mission statement. Okay, so again, kind of going back to the scenario, using information that we've gotten, you can see here, in many ways, these answers are not something that you would pick up on the syllabus easily. Okay, and that tends to be the case for very high level answers in the SCS. Okay, so we're using information from the scenario, we're incorporating information from the pre-scene, and we're using our own kind of critical thinking skills. That's what Cima really, really want to see. Okay. So the precedent as well, and this is probably the best point. So if we change a mission statement in relation to shareholder criticism, it creates a really bad precedent. So it creates a bad set of expectations effectively. So the board's responsible for the strategic management of the company, not the shareholders, okay? And this is something that's been tested before in core activity E, but it could be tested in core activity A as well. So by making the adaptation in response to the criticism, other shareholders may view the board as incompetent, and as a result, they may question who's really in charge of Rhodamine. Okay, so basically what we're saying here is that, if we make this change just in relation to a, kind of a minor criticism, then other stakeholders may say, well, actually, I believe this should be changed, this should be changed, this should be changed. So it doesn't really create kind of, much confidence in the board in terms of their decision making, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through your questions very quickly here. I see there's a few of them. If you want to ask any questions just for 2 minutes, I think it's probably a good idea, because the whole point of these live streams is that there's a bit of interaction and a bit of kind of backwards and forwards. So I'm just looking at my phone. I think it's easier, to be honest with you, just to look at the questions on the phone, because I have to pull them up otherwise, take the slides down and so on, and I have a few monitors up as well. So I'm just looking. There's a question here from Stefano. So thank you so much for joining, and I hope everyone here is getting on well with their studies. I forgot to say, how are you all getting on with the SCS? Okay, so I know you probably see me on WhatsApp. Some of you maybe see me on LinkedIn. Maybe some of you see me on Facebook. I don't know. There's mixed channels. Okay, so should we conclude? I see the question here. Should we conclude with what we think it's more appropriate in the recommendation? So to be honest with you, Stefana, I don't normally recommend conclusions. So you can see the way I've written the answer there for that last question. That's probably the ideal way of structuring your answer for a case study style question at the strategic level, because what we've done is we've effectively matched our answer to the marking grids. Okay, so the marking grids is kind of what determines the amount of marks that you get, and this is something that I talk a bit more about in my course. But just to give you a very basic idea, you have marking grids that the marker will use, and they basically determine what level you should be pitched at and what range of marks you should get. And conclusions don't really fit within those marking grids. And that's why I generally don't recommend having, a specific conclusion or a specific, kind of introduction, because you don't really get marks for them. What you tend to get marks for, and if you want the higher level marks, is this word justification or detail. Okay, so if you look at the past papers for the SCS over the last few years, the highest level answers tend to get marks for detail. They tend to get marks for justification. Okay, so make sure that you're justifying your answers, okay, instead of having kind of specific conclusions. There are some tuition providers that say you should have a heading that says conclusion. That's a load of rubbish. Okay, so take it from me. Are there any other questions before I go on with core activity B? Are we good to go? Hopefully you can hear me okay. I think my voice is going to a certain extent, so I've been teaching all week, okay? Makes sense. Thank you so much. Okay, perfect. There's so many people here, and I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for turning up. Yes, this will be going on for a little bit, so everyone, don't worry about it. Completely free. There's no expectation here. This is just a session for... it really is just to say thanks to all the students who supported my posts and supported my social media and supported my business over the last few weeks and months. As you probably know, I used to work for another tuition provider, and I provide content for Cima's financial leadership program, and I work with Cima on international projects as well. So I just want to say thank you so much everyone for attending. It really means a lot to me. Okay, so the next one. Okay, so I actually see here a question just before we get in. Answers in Kaplan workbooks are quite big. Do you advise us to type big paragraphs? How long should the ideal answer be? Well, this is a good question, and actually something that I address, as you may expect, in my course and my book. What I would suggest is, just to give you a direct answer, is for every 10% that's allocated to a subtask, you should have one paragraph, and that paragraph should probably be about 4 to 6 sentences long. Okay, so a sentence sometimes can be very small, a sentence can be very big. So I would go by that, okay? If you look at a suggested solution that I've given here, this is probably not a bad indication as to, kind of a high level 3 answer, okay? So you don't have to have loads. It is very much quality over quantity, but you do need to make sure that your answer is addressing the question, okay? So hopefully that answers your question. I know it's kind of like, how long is a piece of string? But that may give you some guidance. And we're actually going to go through another few questions here. So this will give you a sense for how to structure your answer and what size you should have. Okay. So let's get on with core activity B. This is the worst core activity. Okay. So probably chances are you may feel the same. So let's look at what core activity B is. It's the one that students tend to do the worst on, if I'm being honest with you, and you'll see the topics being listed in it and you may see why. Okay, so core activity B is evaluate business ecosystem and business environment. So the first assessment outcome for core activity B is I can select and apply suitable strategic analytical tools. So that is effectively the SAF framework. Okay, so suitability, acceptability, feasibility. That's a pretty straightforward question, to be honest with you. The next is I can conduct an analysis of stakeholder needs and recommend appropriate responses. So this is basically stakeholder analysis, pretty straightforward stuff, right? This is where it kind of gets kind of more rotten, okay? So I can recommend appropriate responses to changes in the business ecosystem. So there's a bit of crossover between core activity A and core activity B on ecosystems. And then we have, I can recommend KPIs that can encourage sound strategic management. Now, Cima have not tested this much. They tested it in the last round, okay, and they have tested it the odd time here and there. I think they will test it for this particular case, if I'm being honest with you, because it is one that they have not really put much focus into, and I think they want to change things up. Okay, so if you look at the past papers, you'll see there isn't a huge amount of repetition, so there's only so much room they can kind of go if they want to have questions that are not the same as the past questions. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so the next one is I'm just looking at the questions coming in here. So I can recommend responses to economic, political, and currency risk. So economic risk and currency risk are somewhat related. So typically you'll see those maybe tested together, or you may see them in kind of related questions to a certain extent. And then political risk is one that has been tested a lot quite recently. And I think this particular pre-scene is very much focused on political risk. Okay. So key theory coverage, the first is political risk, as you may have expected based on what I just said there. So a question that could come up is the drivers of political risk. So this has not really come up before. I think this would be a really interesting one for Cima to test. So what actually could create political risk in a new area? Maybe we're looking to purchase a mine in a new country. We have no familiarity with it. What could actually drive that political risk? Well, think about it. So maybe a new election. Okay, so maybe the election of a new government, possibly some of the actions that the business is taking. So maybe if we're engaging in things like, worker exploitation, or maybe we are, possibly not really investing in the mine, something like that. Okay, so that could maybe drive political risk. So we're thinking about things that could maybe annoy the government effectively, putting it in simple terms. Okay, so evaluating political risk. Okay, so when we're talking about political risk, we're talking about adverse actions that the government could basically take against us. Okay, so political risk is technically two ways. So you can have positive, but generally speaking, when we're looking at these types of questions, we're thinking about the negatives. Okay, and you don't need to take my word for it. If you look at the past papers, generally speaking, we're looking at what are the negative actions that the government can take against us. So the first is penalties. Okay, so maybe they could issue us with a penalty, a fine, a sanction. Government contracts. So this is kind of a weaker one. Okay, and basically this says that they may be less favorable when issuing government contracts. Now, there are some countries and some places in the world where there are blind bids, there's tenders that actually prevent this from occurring, but there are some countries where this doesn't exist. Okay, so basically it's just if the government likes you, you get the contract. So it depends on the nature of the country mentioned in this scenario. The tax investigation. So this is one where maybe there may be a kind of a transfer pricing investigation into the business, possibly an investigation into the company's tax affairs within that country in order to kind of, I suppose, react to what the business has done. Asset confiscation. So this is the most harsh one, and this is where basically assets will be confiscated from the business within that country, or maybe there's a forced sale of those assets. So that has happened before, but it's a very drastic situation. So let's say, for example, we have a high-risk country, a new government takes over, the new government says, actually, you know what, we're going to nationalize all the lithium reserves and lithium extraction, and as a result, now you have to go. Okay, so that could potentially come up in your exam. So the next is currency risk, and this is one that students hate, but I'll be honest with you, the range of questions that you can get on currency risk is pretty limited. Okay, so even though it's not the nicest topic, it's pretty limited in terms of what you can be tested on. So you need to be aware, to be honest, in all different types of currency risk questions, of the three main types of currency risk. So the first is economic risk, and this is basically the risk of the present value of the company's cash flows changing as a result of currency, okay, or currency movements. And really this type of risk is the long-term version of transaction risk. Okay, so we're going to talk about transaction risk. This is the risk of a transaction being recorded at one rate and then eventually settled at another rate. Okay, so you can have a gain or a loss as a result, and this has a cash impact on the business. So this actually has a physical cash impact on the business. Same with economic risk. Now, transaction risk is a little bit more short-term. It's just based on individual transactions, whereas economic risk is long-term. Okay, so it can happen, let's say, for example, we have a big contract and that contract is over 10 years and it's in a different currency, and we're repeatedly making payments that are in a different currency, and we're repeatedly incurring these kind of cash effects as a result of engaging in this currency. Translation risk is a little bit different. So translation risk is the currency risk that arises from translating a foreign currency denominated subsidiary. So if we have a subsidiary in a different country, like Rhodamine has, and you may be thinking to yourself, well, how do you know that, Hugh? Well, because within the statement of financial position, you can actually see there's a translation gain or loss recorded, and that means that they have overseas subsidiaries that they've been translating. And when we say translating, what we mean is taking the financial statements of the business and converting them to the P dollar in this case, so the currency that's used in the parent company. And that creates a gain or a loss. Now, this gain or loss is just a paper transaction. It's an accounting transaction. So it doesn't actually have a cash impact on the business, but it's a negative for the business mostly because what it can do is it can actually affect the value of equity. So if you look at the pre-scene, you'll see that the cumulative currency gain or loss is a negative, and this actually has an effect on our equity, and so it can affect gearing. Okay, so that is important because sometimes you have debt covenants that are related to gearing, and those may be breached as a result of currency movements. Okay, so if there's maybe a very drastic movement that creates a gain or a loss that pushes us over our thresholds. The next then is the evaluation of currency risk. So you maybe have a question where, let's say, for example, Rhoda purchases an overseas subsidiary and we have to evaluate the currency risk. Okay, so what currency risk could occur? Well, we could have translation risk. Let's say, for example, the business is maybe engaging in buying and selling with Rhoda itself. That may create transaction risk, may create economic risk. So it depends on the scenario, to be honest with you. The management of currency risk. So this is about hedging. Okay, now hedging is not really tested in a big way, to be honest with you, within the SCS. It's a topic that students tend to be quite worried about because the math side of hedging is quite tricky. It can be quite confusing at some some theories. Futures, for example, can be quite difficult for students. So, to be honest with you, within the SCS, it's not really tested heavily, and when it is tested, it's pretty straightforward. So there are different ways of managing currency risk. The first is to use internal hedging techniques, and don't be afraid to suggest these within the exam. Sometimes the hedging techniques can actually be pretty straightforward. They can be kind of common sense, to be honest with you. So invoicing in your own currency, changing the currency denomination of contracts, possibly engaging in things like leading and lagging. So that can be, a strategy depending on the scenario you're given. And of course, you have external hedging. So you have, for example, a forward contract, you have futures, you have the money market. You also have things like currency swaps. Generally speaking, to be honest with you, the most important one is a forward contract. And this is basically where we make an agreement to purchase or sell a currency at an agreed rate in the future. And this is something that you can pretty much use for most questions that ask you to manage currency risk. Okay, so typically doesn't really go beyond this. Okay. Now, in terms of the benefits, the drawbacks of using forward contracts, the benefit is that it's pretty cheap to do so. It's pretty, inexpensive. Okay, so it's an OTC contract, so it's over the counter. One of the drawbacks is that you're fixed. You have to enter into that arrangement. So if you've written a contract that says that I'm going to do this on this date, you have to do it. Okay, so even if the underlying transaction doesn't occur. So next then is stakeholders. So stakeholders is pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. Okay, now Cima have kind of changed the questions that they used to have on stakeholders. The old questions used to be, identify the stakeholders and evaluate the impact that this particular strategy or decision would have on them. To be honest with you, they've kind of upped the difficulty on these questions a little bit, but it's still a pretty straightforward question. So really, what is a stakeholder? It's a party that's affected by the business. Okay, so we identify stakeholders. You could have questions around who are the stakeholders in a particular situation, and really this is pretty straightforward. Normally the scenario will point to who is affected by this decision or this event. So I would use the scenario to guide my answer. Okay, if you have a question that asks you to identify stakeholders, and again you may have a question that says evaluate the impacts on stakeholders. So trying to think about how a certain event would, I know it's kind of written here, but how it would affect them. Okay, so for example, let's say Rhoda has I don't know, maybe they've purchased a sodium mine. Okay, so how would this affect various different stakeholders? Well, it's going to affect shareholders because it's going to affect their returns. Let's say, for example, the sodium mine, it's not performing as well as we thought it would. Maybe the technology for sodium ion batteries is delayed, such and such. That could affect stakeholders. Maybe it could affect, if we're looking to purchase mines, might affect employees. If we have maybe cross transfers between the mines, maybe there's problems there. Okay, so again, it's not a great example, but pretty much these questions are straightforward enough. Now, this is a new type of question. So evaluating the power and interest. So you can see here, this is the application of the Mendelov matrix. So to be honest with you, weaker answers would actually specifically use the Mendelov matrix and specify it and really go into detail on the theory. What you're really looking for with a high quality SCS answer is using the theory without having to mention it. Okay, so in this particular case, yes, power and interest comes from the Mendelov matrix, but you don't have to go in a big tirade about the Mendelov matrix. You're probably not going to get marks for it. Really, if we're asked to evaluate the power and interest, we should be thinking about how much influence does this stakeholder have over the business, and will that change as a result of this decision or this strategy or this proposal? And the interest is how much are they affected by the business as a result of this, whatever decision that we're about to make. Okay. The next one is the recognition of fringe stakeholders. So this came up before, and this was a really interesting question. If you're in the UK, you may be familiar with the protest group Just Stop Oil. Basically, Cima created this scenario where there was a Just Stop Oil type protest group. They went in, they caused damage, and there was a question as to whether we should identify these protesters as stakeholders. Are they stakeholders? and what's the effect of recognizing them? So an interesting question, because are they stakeholders? Yes, they are. They meet the definition of a stakeholder, but there's problems with identifying them as a stakeholder, because if we say that these are stakeholders of the business, then we have to consider how we're going to treat them. If we give them too much attention, it may give validity or credibility to their actions, and if they engaged in illegal actions against the business, then that's a bad thing. Okay, so that was an interesting question. It could come up for Rhodamine, if I'm being honest with you, because you could have a situation where maybe protesters storm one of the mines, and there's a question as to whether we should recognize them as stakeholders, how we should engage with them, and maybe how we repair the damage that they caused to our share price. Okay, so maybe we have an impact on our share price as a result of all of these protests and damage and so on and so forth. The next is stakeholders of stakeholders. So our stakeholders of stakeholders are stakeholders. Okay, so I think I said stakeholder there about 5 times. This was a question that came up before in the past about whether a customer of a customer is our stakeholder. And the answer there is basically yes. But what Cima we're looking for is you to understand what a stakeholder is and to be able to apply that definition, basically. Okay, and again, kind of giving more nuance to your answer, you can say, yes, they are stakeholders of ours, but they're probably not one that we can, actively do much about. Okay, so they're probably a lower level one. The next is analytical tools. So you may have a question around Pestel. This has come up every now and again. So the Pestel analysis is kind of straightforward enough, to be honest with you, but the questions tend to be pretty awkward, if I'm being honest. So Pestel, just so we break it down, is political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal factors. So we use this when we're creating strategies or carrying out an external environment analysis. So we've had questions in the past where we've had to use this to predict and deal with the environment. So that could come up. So maybe we use Pestel analysis to evaluate the effect of, let's say, the implementation of new laws around how much lithium we can extract. Challenges in carrying out the analysis. So for some of these factors, it can be difficult to actually carry out an analysis. So probably the main one here is social. Okay, so sometimes it can be difficult to evaluate social factors. So it's typically based on demographics and kind of qualitative factors that are hard to measure. The SAF model. So this is kind of everyone's favorite framework because it makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. Suitability, acceptability, and feasibility. So suitability is about whether the strategy is in alignment with our mission and our vision. Is it a strategic fit for the business? Acceptability, is it acceptable to our stakeholders? Typically, I advise students here to talk about the financial returns. Is that acceptable for shareholders? And there's shareholders. Shareholders, and then risk. So does it present an adequate amount of risk for our shareholders as well? So think about risk and return. Okay, so 1 paragraph on risk, 1 paragraph on return always works. Okay, so I always suggest students do that. Feasibility, so do we have the skills, do we have the finances, do we have the data, do we have the resources to carry out the strategy? So you could be examining the use of the model and as well the challenges in using the model. So Cima have kind of graduated the questions beyond just using the model. So in the past, sometimes they've asked, what are the challenges in evaluating the acceptability of this particular strategy? Okay, so the next thing is performance measures. So this was one that I said, it's not really been tested much, but it has actually been tested recently, and I think this could come up in your exam. So the first is critical success factors. So these are the factors that need to go right for a strategy to succeed. So you could be tested on what are the critical success factors for this particular proposal and what's the importance of them. The next then is key performance indicators. So you could be given a question where, and this is kind of related to the point underneath, where maybe you're given a series of key performance indicators and you're asked to evaluate them. So are they actually good for what we are intending to use them for? And they could be around sustainability. So you may have picked up on this already, but the pre-scene is all about sustainability reporting, sustainability performance. That's going to be a key theme within the exam. Okay, so you could be given a series of performance measures and asked, are these appropriate for measuring our sustainability? You could be given a series of poor quality KPIs and you have to kind of comment on them. So OCS is very much on lower level, production based, sales based KPIs. These KPIs are more so about measuring strategy, the achievement of strategy. So they're a bit more higher level. Okay. So the next one there is interest rate risk. And this one is kind of the one that everyone is scared of. Okay. So it hasn't really been tested much in the exam. To be honest with you, this is how I see it being tested. And, it's not the most difficult. Okay. So as you'll probably see here, the questions don't go too far into detail on the hedging strategies, which is typically where students get a little bit spooked. So the first one here is, the effect of a change in interest rates. So what effect would a change in the interest rates have on a strategy? So we're thinking here about demand. Okay, so if we have an increase in interest rates, that's likely to affect our demand negatively. Okay, so there's less discretionary income. In our particular case, we're selling lithium. Lithium goes to these electric vehicle manufacturers. If they're creating cars, well, that's going to have an effect on the demand for those cars. So if there's less income available for everyone, well, that's going to affect their demand. That's going to have an effect on us as a result. But also, if you think about cars, a lot of cars are purchased on car financing, which is based on interest rates. So if we have an increase in interest rates, it's going to increase the cost of those leasing plans, and that then is going to have an effect on demand. Okay. So the next is financing cost. This is a little bit more obvious. So if we have debt denominated in, variable interest rates, that's going to affect the amount of financing that we pay. And as well, if we have fixed rates, fixed rates don't always last forever. So sometimes you have to, renegotiate them every 5 years. If you have a mortgage, you'll know all about that. And that could be the case. So if we have an increase in interest rates, well, our fixed rate term might actually be ending and we have to renegotiate it. Interest rates are higher, we face a higher financing cost. The next then is the viability of strategies. So some strategies may actually become non-viable as a result of an increase in interest rates, particularly if they're funded using debt. So if we said we would use debt to finance this particular strategy, but actually we have an increase in the cost of debt, we recalculate the NPV, the net present value, we may actually see that it's negative. And that can happen in the real world. Interaction with currency rates. So you may be given a question on the international Fisher effect, which is pretty straightforward. Okay, so the international Fisher effect really just says that the country that has the higher inflation rate is the one that will see its currency depreciate relative to the other one. Okay, so the question could come up saying, could we use different interest rates in order to predict where currency rates will go in the future? And the answer there is yes, to a certain extent, because we have this international Fisher effect. However, it's not super duper effective in the long run. Okay, or in the short run. Sorry, it's not super effective in the short run. In the long run, there's limited usefulness, to be honest with you, as well. But in the short run, you can have lots of things that can affect currency rates. Okay, so we can have speculation, we can have political action, and so on and so forth, that we can't really predict that well sometimes. The next then is the management of interest rate risk, and again, it's similar to currency risk. We can have internal, external. To be honest with you, external swaps are probably the most applicable, probably the most used in the real world as well. But you could have FRAs. Okay, so an FRA is basically where you lock in an interest rate for a short term, and that interest rate can be for deposits and it can also be for borrowing. Okay, so it works both ways. And basically the FRA rate is the rate that you will pay or the rate that you will deposit at. Okay, and it's very short term. Okay, so I don't know how applicable it is in this particular case because of its short term nature, but that is one that maybe you could use. It hasn't come up before, so how to manage interest rate risk, but it could. Okay, typically, if a question comes up like that, you would use swaps because it's something that's a little bit more practical. Okay, so some questions here. So let's kind of run through the questions for each of the topics. So political risk. So the first, evaluate the political risks resulting from environmental damage, worker exploitation, poor safety oversight. Recommend how political risk following an expansion might be managed. So how would we manage political risk? Well, we have things like pre-trading agreements, we have good relations with the government, we follow the laws, abide by ethics, abide by, policies, possibly engaging in lobbying is another one. Evaluate the factors that can increase political risk if mining rights are granted. So again, that was kind of talking about the drivers of political risk that we already read through. So in terms of currency risk, evaluate the pros and cons of raising overseas finance to buy a mine. So maybe using debt denominated in a different currency. That question has come up loads in the past. Recommend how a large supplier contract could be hedged, and maybe evaluate whether changes in interest rates can predict currency movements. So the international Fisher effect, that came up before for the pre-seen airfield, which was based on an airport, and it was a question that students did really bad in. Okay, so the next one is stakeholders. So recommend if fringe protester groups should be recognised as stakeholders. Cima could take the same direction as they did in the past. Evaluate and identify the power and influence of stakeholders following an incident. So maybe something like environmental damage caused by rhodamine. Recommend the approach to build support among stakeholders for EV grants, so electric vehicle grants. So maybe we have a question where we have to combine forces with different companies in order to create these electric vehicle grants, which would increase demand for electric vehicles, but they would have to be passed by the government. So this is based on the Inflation Reduction Act that happened in the United States, where there was these incentives for electric vehicles, and it created an increase in demand for those electric vehicles, and it was good for lithium mining companies. So analytical tools. So explain how Pestel analysis can show the implications of withdrawing an EV grant. Possibly could come up. Evaluate the SAF, so the suitability, acceptability, and feasibility of acquiring a sodium-ion battery company. Explain the challenges in evaluating the acceptability of divesting a mine. So going back to the challenges. Performance measures, so recommend improvements to sustainability measures and reporting, and possibly recommend performance measures for a newly acquired company. So it could be, in this case, I said an AI company, it could be anything. So maybe we have performance measures that we need to put in place to make sure that that business is working towards our overall mission, or maybe the objectives that we've set for it. And you may actually have to come up with the objectives, so that could be another question. Explain why and how cyber risk could be managed as a critical success factor. So this question kind of came up before in the past, how something could be managed as a critical success factor. So basically what we're saying is, how could we make this high priority? So what do? We add it to risk reports, we put it in the board's agenda, we make some, in this case, a board appointment maybe in relation to cyber risk, okay? The next then, interest rate risk. So evaluate the impact on a strategy of interest rates increasing. So this came up before in the past. We talked about that. Demand, costs, viability, okay? Evaluate whether interest rates can be used to predict currency movements. Recommend ways of managing interest rate risk from newly issued debt. So that would be a question about hedging interest, okay? So let's look at a worked example here. So Rhodamine's board is considering putting together a cash offer to acquire the company Terra AI. So this company is based in the country of Sealand, which uses the S dollar as its currency, which is weaker than the P dollar. The company provides software that uses AI models to predict the location of lithium, cobalt, and nickel reserves. The company mostly serves clients based in Poland, and so it regularly invoices customers using the P dollar. So this is actually based off of a real scenario that came up before. It seems a little bit odd, so it invoices customers using the P dollar. This is what Cima actually did themselves in a scenario. So, you should be prepared if something similar comes up. So the P dollar and the S dollar exchange rate is volatile. That's a key piece of information here, and you'll see why. So recommend the approach for evaluating and managing currency risks associated with the ownership of Terra AI, and this is worth 40%. So I would suggest in this case 4 paragraphs. Now, the marking grids, I can almost guarantee, if this question came up in your exam, would be half the marks for evaluating the risks. You can see here, evaluating currency risks. And then the other half would be for managing. Okay, so if, for example, you had an answer and you went straight into hedging, you would only get 50% of the marks. So that's why it's really important to read through the question super slowly, super carefully. The first bit was on evaluation, the second part was on managing. If you only had one, you're only going to get 50% of the marks, even if that answer is really good. Okay, so that's the nature of the marking grids. It's a bit ruthless like that. So let's go through some potential answers you could have here. So in terms of evaluation, the first thing, and this is used frequently within Cima's own answers, is looking at historic data. Okay, so if we want to evaluate currency risk, basically you go through past data. What has been the currency rate over the last X number of years, 5, 6, 7 years or so on. And this will help us kind of give a perspective on the volatility itself. So it may be the case that the volatility was the result of maybe extraordinary events. So we all know about things like Brexit, US elections. Those have big impacts on currencies. And actually the volatility may have been the result of these events, or it may have been the case that we had a new government elected or something like that. So it may actually be the case that that's no longer occurring. Okay, so we need to be aware of that. It may also be the case that actually the volatility is still occurring, and that is something that we need to be aware of. And that's something that we'll find out by going through historic data. The next then is to look at interest rates. So actually, yes, looking at past data is useful, but it does have limitations because the past is not always a good predictor of the future. So we could do things like looking at the interest rate differentials between the two countries, and this is basically the application of the international Fisher effect, which says that the country with the higher nominal interest rate would see its currency depreciate because that's normally an indication that it has a higher inflation rate. And as a result, it could give us an indication as to what the future pairing will be. Now, if there's a minimal differential, so basically a minimal difference between the interest rates of the two countries, then the volatility is likely to be reduced. So that's something we could use. So the next then is the management. Now, you'll see here, right, so this is something I was talking about. This is kind of a common sense answer. And if you look at past scenarios that Cima have put together in past answers, you'll see that often the hedging strategies that they use are pretty straightforward. They're not looking for futures. They may, okay, so it may come up in your paper, but often it's the case that they're using scenario-specific solutions, okay? So in this case, the first is just to accept the risk, okay? So transaction risk arises in this case because revenues will be received in P dollars, but costs will be incurred in S dollars. So if the P dollar weakens relative to the S dollar, that has an adverse cash impact on the business. But it's a long-term risk, okay? So you can actually say maybe it's economic risk, okay? That might be a sentence you could actually add into your answer. And it may have to be accepted because the cost of hedging may actually outweigh the benefits. And this is the trademark of kind of a higher level answer, is saying that really the cost of hedging may not actually be worth it. So a lower level answer would say, yeah, hedging's a great idea. But actually in the real world, it may not actually be worth it. So it may be worth just kind of accepting that gains that we make in 1 year may be offset against losses in another year. So I used to work as a treasurer many years ago for a big company. And in the real world, people actually do this. So they look at it and they go, it's just not worth hedging. Okay, so that can be the case sometimes. There's also translation risk that arises from owning an overseas entity, and that may actually be accepted on the basis that it doesn't have a cash impact on the business, therefore do we have to worry about it? And a lot of businesses do that, okay? The next then is actively engaging in hedging. So if the currency rate is expected to lead to continued adverse impacts, acceptance may not be feasible. So you can add that into your answer. Instead, maybe we can try and renegotiate contracts so that actually Terra AI's domestic currency, which is the S dollar, is used instead for invoicing. So again, that's an internal hedging strategy, really simple, really straightforward. But you could add in here, just to make it a little bit more realistic, to actually convince customers to do this. Possibly, an ongoing discount is given or some form of incentive, which is something that you would have to do in the real world. And to manage the translation risk, what we tend to do is we tend to raise debt in the overseas subsidiary, and that has the effect of reducing the overall equity of the overseas subsidiary. So when we convert the financial statements into the group currency, the overall exposure is less. Okay, so basically what we're doing is we're making the overseas entity worth less. So when we convert it into our financial statements, the currency of our group financial statements, which is the P dollar in this case, there's less risk, there's less room to have that kind of gain or loss. Okay, that's effectively why companies sometimes raise debt in order to manage this translation risk. Okay, so I'm going to just look at your questions. My voice is actually going here, so I'm just going to take a 2-minute break to look at your questions. Okay, so there's a question: can you share these slides if possible? I don't know if I can, to be honest with you, because these slides actually come from my course, and so I think I would be putting myself out of business if I share the slides. But what I might do is I might actually upload this session, just depending on the quality. So I need to make sure that the quality is acceptable, right, for YouTube. Sometimes YouTube is it's not amazing in terms of like taking live streams and then re-uploading them. So there is an option after this for me to upload it. We'll see what it's like. If it's good, then I'll upload it, and effectively you'll have a digital copy of the slides that you can view. Okay, so I'm just looking at this. Okay, so there's a question here that says, from Alex. Nice to see you, Alex. Thank you so much for joining. What's the difference between forward and futures? So with a forward, basically, it's an OTC contract, so it's over the counter, and it's a customized contract. And basically, it's where you accept a certain rate, whether you're buying or selling. Okay, so you have to engage in that rate, and you say, okay, in the future, I want to buy $200,000 using X number of pounds. So that's what a forward is. Now, futures is a little bit different. So futures are exchange traded, which means that they're traded on a stock exchange. So basically what happens with futures is it's like a bet. Okay, so a future is basically like a bet. We purchase futures or we sell futures, and over time those futures are worth more or less. So currency futures in this case, there's different types of futures. And the reason why a company would use futures is to basically offset any gains or losses on a transaction. So these future contracts, they're liquid, okay, so that's their main benefit. So when you buy a future from a exchange, it's, let's say, locked in at a certain rate. So it depends on the context, which you would do, which you would buy or you sell. But let's say, for example, we buy these futures, okay? So we're looking to buy these. Maybe they appreciate in value. We've set up the future in such a way that if it appreciates in value, that's going to offset any losses that we have on the underlying transaction. Okay, so to explain futures, typically it's a good idea actually to have an example. So sorry about that. But basically the difference between the two is that future is exchange traded, which means it's purchased and sold on an exchange, and it requires a margin up front. So you have to actually deposit funds into the exchange before you can purchase it. And that margin is deducted or added to on a certain timely basis, whereas with the forward it's basically a customized agreement. Okay, so standardized for a future, non-standardized for a forward. Okay, sorry, my voice is really bad, which is embarrassing. Okay, so the next one is, how important is it to include industry examples in our answer? Not that important, to be honest with you. I think this is something that students tend to go kind of wrong on, is like, real world examples. So in my book, right, for example, I have some real world examples that I go through, and really it's just to give you kind of a general idea of the industry, so you have a general sense for what goes on in the real world. But to be honest with you, you're not going to get marks for incorporating this real world example happened, 4 years ago with this company. Albemarle is the one that everyone uses. It's an American lithium mining company. To be honest with you, you're not really going to get marks for that. So it's something that I see a lot, and it's actually with like higher level students is they tend to think, okay, if I show off my knowledge, if I show off that I understand the real world, I'm going to get marks. And I used to be like this. You probably won't. Okay, so trying to stick to the world of the pre-scene, as frustrating as that can be sometimes, okay, try to stick to the world of the pre-scene and use the information from the pre-scene or from the scenario instead, because that's really what the markers want to see. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question. Is reputation risk a part of core activity B? It's a good question. It is. Sometimes you'll see, and the reason why I hesitate to answer this, sometimes you will see this when you go through the past papers. There's basically a grid at the start of the past papers when you go down to the bottom bit where there's kind of the answers and everything, and just before you get the splits. So basically Cima have these kind of allocations, and they show you what core activity past questions were related to. You can actually see sometimes they swap them about. So I have seen reputation risk fall under core activity D, but yes, it probably should be B. Okay, so B, D, it can be either, to be honest with you. To be honest, like in terms of the core activities, right, for a student, if I was a student, would I care about core activities? Probably not too much, because the reality of the core activities is that they're so broad that they don't really help you too much in terms of guiding what could be tested on the paper. It's just a convenient way for a tuition provider to split up the topics, to be honest with you, in terms of what could be tested. Because you'll see here, and this is an interesting one, that as we go through the various different core activities, it's very hard to allocate some topics that do actually come up within the paper. So in this one, for example, core activity C, it's very hard to map back share price and efficient market hypothesis, which is tested regularly, but you won't see it written here in the assessment outcomes. So that's why it's good sometimes to use a tuition provider that knows what they're talking about, because if you were just to stick to the core activities, you would be, you wouldn't do too well in the exam if you just listed them off and said, I'm going to study this, and this. So hopefully that's useful to you. Deanne, so my comments on mocks are all about not using industry knowledge. Yeah, I just, I'll be honest with you, like, I just think it's a bad idea. And I appreciate what students are trying to do. They're trying to show, I understand the industry and I've done my research and I've done hard work. And that's totally fine, okay? And I totally get it. I've sat these exams before myself, and like, I understand, you know what I mean? You want to show the marker that you've done hard work, you've done the graft. But there's better ways of going about it. So if you're looking to maximize your marks, use the scenario, use the pre-scene, please. Okay, so I know you're probably thinking, what does this guy know about the SES exam? Trust me, I have helped thousands of students, right? So literally thousands of people pass this exam over the last few years, and I really do, I do know for certain some of these things. Okay, so please take my word on that. Is there any other question before I get going? I'm kind of stalling because my voice is so bad, it's so sore. This is what happens. You teach all week, and then you get to the end of the week and you decide, yeah, I'm going to hop on a live stream and show everyone how broken my voice is. There's no other questions, is there? Let's have a look here. Anyone want to ask one before I go? On to the next core activity. Core activity C. So this is, core activity C is slightly easier, to be honest with you, than core activity B. Typically, what students tend to find difficult with core activity B is interest rate risk and currency risk. The rest of it is kind of, it's okay. Questions around, the pestle analysis and all that can be a little bit awkward sometimes, the way Cima phrases questions. As well, if you're not if you're a person whose first language is not English, right? So it can be pretty difficult to kind of pick up on what actually Cima is asking. Even, if English is your first language, it can be difficult to understand exactly what it is that they want from us, okay? So I get students all the time ask me this question. I don't understand the question. And, sometimes I don't either, to be honest with you. Like, the way it's written can be a little bit awkward. So the best way to approach those types of situations is to break it up into smaller pieces. And also to look at how Cima have approached their own questions in the past, because that'll give you an idea as to how they interpret their own questions. So that's what I've been doing the last few years, is looking at exam papers. As soon as they come out, it's like Christmas for me. It comes out and I look at it and I go, okay, this is how it was examined. This is how to approach it. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so I'm just checking the questions. I have them on my phone, just if you've just joined, I have my phone beside me because it's easier than looking at the screen. Okay, so core activity C is quite a short one, but it is one that's really important. Okay, so this is all really about F3 or the financial pillar if you're using the FLP platform. So the first is I can recommend suitable sources of finance. This one's pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. The next one is I can recommend dividend policy. Students tend to do quite badly in that one. I can recommend and apply business valuation models. This one is actually pretty straightforward, but people tend to get a little bit worried about it, okay? Now, you'll notice here there's no mention of share price and efficient market hypothesis. This is tested regularly, and it falls under core activity C. I suppose you could probably put it within valuing businesses, because share prices are sometimes used for valuing businesses. But to be honest, it should be written as an assessment outcome. Okay, so in terms of the core theory that you need to know here, so the first is sources of finance, and this is actually pretty straightforward. So we probably know this from the MCS if you've sat the MCS, and I know some of you may actually be A-star students, or you may be, there's loads of programs that Cima have, CSEP, CFO program, Golden Key. There's been loads over the years. This may be your only exam that you're sitting, but if you've sat the MCS, you probably are aware of sources of finance. It's a big question that comes up in the MCS. So raising capital for projects, equity issues and debt issues. So you may have a question where you're examined on rights issues. You may be actually examined specifically on rights issues, or you may have a question that's a little bit more general and says, how should we finance this particular strategy? Or how should we engage in terms of raising debt, raising equity, or should we maybe have a share for share exchange if it's an acquisition? So that question came up where we were given 3 options and we had to evaluate them. So pretty straightforward, rights issue. You've been kind of tested in the past on things that we need to consider when we're carrying out a rights issue. So if you get a question like that, we need to consider the discount that we're applying to the shares. We need to consider the amount of information that we're going to put out into the market about the use of the funds. Okay, so that's an important one. You can also have the use of an underwriter. So are we actually going to use an underwriter? So basically an underwriter will purchase the shares that are not purchased, so they can kind of guarantee that the rights issue will be successful, but there's obviously a charge for that. So we need to consider that. Debt issues, in terms of debt issues at the SES level, we're talking here about, are we going to exceed maybe a debt covenant as a result of raising debt? You could have a situation where maybe we're raising debt and there's a question about the capital structure. Okay, so this has come up before where there was a question that said, should we raise debt, and then later on in the year, should we raise equity to pay off that debt? Okay, so there was a question about whether that was an adequate financing strategy. And it was kind of a weird question, to be honest with you, but the answer to that question is, well, it tends to be the case that the cost of equity is higher than the cost of debt because equity holders take on more risk. So when the business goes bust, or if it goes bust, and let's say this business does, what will happen is all the assets would be sold, and the people who get the money first are the debt holders and then the equity holders. So basically the equity holders take on more risk, so they want more return as a result. So in this particular case, where we had the suggestion of raising debt and then raising equity to pay off the debt, it was a bad idea, because what we're doing is we're basically replacing capital with more expensive capital. Okay, so it was a tough question, to be honest with you. It could come up in your paper. I think it was pretty poorly answered from what I understand. And when I say these things, when I say it was poorly answered, I'm just kind of looking at the examiner's report, so I'm taking their word for it. Okay, so raising capital for acquisitions, pretty straightforward. It comes up every now and again. Share exchanges, so evaluate the arguments for and against using a share exchange. Maybe Rhodamine purchases a big business, maybe a listed business, and we have to evaluate if it's worth using a share exchange. They're typically used for purchasing big businesses, okay, because they don't put a big strain on liquidity, so we don't have to raise loads of debt, which is a good thing, but obviously there's a dilution impact as a result of using a share exchange. The next is an earnout. So an earnout arrangement is basically where a part of the consideration is given in return for achieving targets. So for example, there was recently an earnout arrangement with a pharmaceutical company where they purchased another pharmaceutical company, and they said, well, actually a part of the sale says that you have to achieve a certain research and development project that has to be basically become viable. So it was like a new drug, and that new drug has to be approved by this certain health board, and then we will release X number of funds for this company. Okay, so basically it's a contingent part of the sale. Okay, so an earnout arrangement, it is actually a form of raising capital, but not tested. It's never been tested before, but it could be tested. Cash offer is pretty straightforward. This is where we purchase the shares using cash. Now, it doesn't mean that we go in and we just go into our bank account and we decide to purchase a business. It means that we either raise debt or equity, or we use cash reserves to purchase the business. So typically businesses that we're looking to purchase at this level are very expensive because Rhodomine's a big listed company. So what they would do is they probably raise debt. But you could suggest in your answer that raising debt, whilst it is a good idea to a certain extent because we have lots of tangible assets that we can use as collateral to reduce our interest costs, it is also, has its own set of risks because it's going to increase finance costs. It may be the case that we push our our gearing ratio beyond whatever threshold we've agreed in our debt covenants. And just if you're not aware of debt covenants, I know some students here may be thinking to themselves, what is he talking about? A debt covenant is basically a rule that you agree to, or contract that you agree to when you take on debt. So covenants can come in the form of gearing ratios. So you agree to not take on debt beyond a certain gearing ratio. Sometimes you have debt covenants in relation to the maintenance of assets. Sometimes you have debt covenants in relation to the amount of dividends that you can pay. So it depends, okay? But typically it's around the gearing ratio. You can have other issues, okay? So could be possibly that question around structuring the debt and the equity. That type of question could come up. Dealing with covenants. So maybe we have a question where we want to raise debt beyond the threshold that we agreed to. That came up before in the past. It's only come up once. And the question was basically asking us, how do we raise debt beyond the threshold that we agreed with the bank? You can basically change your gearing ratio. So you can maybe withhold the dividend payment. Possibly you could raise equity instead of raising debt. That might be one way to raise the same amount of finance. It could be the case that you actually restructure finance. So what companies tend to do is they'll go to another financial institution and they'll say, well, can I get a loan to pay off my existing loan, and we'll have a different set of terms in that new loan. And some companies do this, okay? So some financial institutions will say, yes, I'll take that on, okay? The next then is dividend policy. So basically the dividend policy questions in the past used to be like quite small and pretty straightforward. The new types of dividend policy questions are a little bit more complex in the exam. So this question has come up a few times, I believe, in the most recent set of exams, and it's forgoing dividend for investments. So can we fund an investment by effectively forgoing a dividend? And it's an interesting question because if we forgo a dividend, yes, it does release cash that we can use for an investment, but think about the signaling effect, okay? So it may create this signaling effect that says, well, the business may do this in the future, okay? So if you're someone who's invested in Rhodomine and you expect to get a dividend every year, this basically says that, well, it may be the case that if a new opportunity comes up, the company may actually use your dividend to invest in this opportunity, and that mightn't be something that the existing shareholders want. So as a result, they may sell their shares and they may move on to a different investment. The next then is changing dividend policy. So it may be the case that the business changes its dividend policy from, let's say, a fixed to maybe a flat payment, maybe to a proportional payment, maybe to zero scrip dividends, okay, which is basically where we pay dividends in the form of shares, bonus dividends, and so on and so forth. You might have questions around warning markets in advance. So if it's the case that the business is looking like it's not going to make profitability targets, do we warn the markets in advance and say, look, we're not going to make our dividend this year? Okay, so there's pros and cons associated with that. One of the pros is that it reduces the volatility of the share price when, effectively we come to the end of the year and we say, look, we didn't make enough money. We're going to kind of preempt that a little bit, so it's not going to be as drastic of an effect on the company's share price. But of course, you run the risk if you warn markets and you cause that volatility when you create that warning, and then actually you have a pretty good few months and actually you are able to make the dividend payment, then you've created what they call unnecessary volatility. Okay, so that can occur. Enacting one-offs. So one-offs in this case could be things like share repurchases, where a business purchases its own shares. What are the pros and cons of doing this? One-off dividends. So this is an interesting one, and students have actually performed pretty badly in these types of questions in the past. A one-off dividend, so let's say, for example, the business has a windfall gain as a result of a big spike in lithium pricing, and there's no use for the funds. So one of the suggestions is that the business should use these funds for a one-off dividend, a big, massive dividend. Well, of course, a lower level answer would say, yeah, it's a great idea because it's going to keep the shareholders happy. But actually, a lot of shareholders would not be happy with the big one-off dividends, because a lot of shareholders typically have tax planning in place that basically is set up in such a way that they know the amount of dividend they're going to get, and they have their taxes set up so that when they get that dividend, everything is in alignment, okay? But if you have a big, massive release of a dividend, it may actually push the shareholder up into a different marginal band, and as a result, their tax planning is ineffective. So a lot of shareholders don't like these one-off dividends as a result. The kind of more sophisticated institutional ones, typically don't like these. Scrip dividends, so where we basically pay shares in the form of dividends, that's never been tested before. Would be an interesting one if Cima did test it, to be honest with you. The next then is business valuation. So you need to be aware of the main techniques. These are pretty straightforward. So the asset-based valuation method, where basically we're taking assets from liabilities. There's different ways in which you can do this. So you can value assets using their book values. You can use the fair value. You can use the replacement value. Typically, the fair values are the best way of going about it, but it depends on the nature of the business. Dividend-based, so you can use the dividends of the business to value it. So if you have a business, for example, that's a startup business, likely they're not going to have dividends, or they may not even have profits. So this type of methodology is probably not that useful. Earnings based is where we basically take the earnings and we multiply it by a proxy PE ratio, or price earnings ratio. And this is a really easy way of valuing a business. It's something that is done in the real world. It's a very quick way of valuing a business, and it's easy to get the information to carry out this valuation methodology. However, it's not based on cash flows. There's no discounting, so it's not entirely accurate. Cash based, this is probably the most accurate, and it's probably going to generate the highest possible value for the business. This is where we take the cash flows that we expect the business to generate and we basically discount them. Okay, so we take the time value of money into consideration, and we say, okay, this is what the business is going to value over a certain number of years, and you can make adjustments. That's the big benefit of it, is you can make one-offs. You can put in, your assumptions into the model, and then you discount it. So you take the time value of money into consideration, and you have a kind of a value. Now, what tends to happen in the real world is beyond a certain time period, we have the cash flows going into perpetuity. So we say, okay, well, after year 15, we're going to expect, cash flows to just kind of be a certain amount every year. So there will be some planning for some years, and then after a while, we just say, here's the value of all the rest, okay, because we can't plan, 100 years in advance, okay, so that tends to be what happens in, investment banks where they value businesses. Okay, so challenges in valuing businesses. So this has come up a good few times. So Cima will give you kind of an awkward business, an unlisted company, maybe, owner, ran business, an entrepreneurial business. It's not a perfect business to value, and as a result we have some challenges. So maybe the business is a service-based business, so asset-based valuations are going to be useless. Maybe it doesn't pay a dividend, so what good is a dividend-based valuation? If it doesn't have a profit, what good is an earnings-based valuation? So these are the challenges, okay? So we'd have to use a cash-based. But again, that may not be perfect, because the expectations that the owner has in terms of the cash that the business is going to generate may be very different to what Rhodamine thinks the business is going to generate. Valuing a divestment. So this is really short. Basically, I just want to say here that if you're looking to value a divestment, this actually came up in the past. It's the same thing as valuing an acquisition. Okay, so the only difference is that we have more information. Okay, so the next thing is the share price and the efficient market hypothesis. So the efficient market hypothesis is never directly tested, okay, but it is important to be aware of, because it can be used in your answers in relation to share price movements. And basically what it says is that the share price is always trading at fair values, and there's various strengths of this theory. So the weak form efficiency says that the share price takes into consideration past data. The semi-strong level of market efficiency basically says that the share price takes into consideration all known information, all public information, and the strong level of market efficiency suggests that the share price takes into consideration all private and public information. So it tends to be the case in the real world that companies operate within the semi-strong level of market efficiency. So the New York Stock Exchange is an example of a stock exchange that has semi-strong levels of market efficiency. And what this basically means is that if you have a company like Tesla, and you have a news report that says Tesla's cars are not going to ship on the date that we thought they would, the 20,000 cars, actually production only ran 15,000 and they're only going to ship 10,000. That's a negative piece of information about the business. That's going to affect the share price negatively. Okay, so that's basically it. Impact on share price as a result of certain events. That's a key question that comes up over and over and over again. So short-term impacts, long-term impacts. So in the short term, likely it's the case that this particular decision or this event is going to affect the share price. But of course, we have speculation that goes on in the markets as well. So that can kind of cloud what's actually going on. In the long run, though, and this is where, again, we have higher level answers, you could always say in these types of questions, in the long run, really what's going to determine the share price is whether we're generating shareholder value. So yes, we may have this short-term situation. Yes, we may have this short-term event. But actually in the real world, if we're continuously generating shareholder value, these dips are not that important. So you see this with the company Meta. So it's like, Facebook, they rebranded as Meta. They had these kind of share price decreases because of their multiverse strategy. Didn't really do too well. But actually now you see, because they've been generating shareholder value in the long run, you can see that their shares are actually way up. Okay, so that's one maybe to look at. The next thing is interpreting share price movements. So you may have a question where there's a share price movement and then you're asked, well, why did this happen? Okay, so for example, you may have an acquisition, you may have new strategies, possibly you have events, so like a cyber attack, we have share price, kind of going downwards, and you're asked to interpret this. So what happened here? Okay, so that could be a question that comes up in your paper. This is a new style of question that Cima have, and it's protecting the share price or making sure that information is incorporated within the share price. And really what they're testing is efficient market hypothesis. So what you could say here is, if we're looking to protect the share price against a negative event, firstly, what we can do is we can release positive information into the markets about the business. We can engage in briefings with market analysts. So these market analysts would typically make recommendations about different investments. And if we give them information, they can make recommendations about our shares, so Road shares. And that then can help, increase the share price or protect it. Okay, so basically negating any negative impacts as a result of maybe a negative situation that has occurred with the business. And you could also say in your answer that, okay, yes, we can protect it in the short term, but really the main play that we have is to make sure that we're generating shareholder value in the long run, and that's going to increase the share price in the long term. Okay. The next then is incorporating information. So trying to make sure that you're incorporating information within the share price. So we're talking here more so about positive information. So making sure that positive events are being incorporated within the share price. How do we do that? We release information. The same thing, engage with market analysts, making sure that we're conscious of long-term shareholder value generation. The next thing is beta. So this is a topic that people really hate, and it's something that's been tested recently. It was tested in the past as well for a precinct called KCTP, and it was one that was like really bad for students. Okay, so this is one that I think Cima will retest, okay, because it is a difficult one. So, what do we use beta for? Well, typically it's used in the CAPM, so the capital asset pricing model. Basically what you need to know here is that we use this model to calculate the cost of equity, and this formula requires the beta in order to calculate the cost of equity. So if we have an increase in the beta, that's going to lead to an increase in the cost of equity. An increase in the cost of equity is going to lead to an overall increase in the company's cost of capital, which is typically a paragraph that you can use in beta style questions. What's the significance of beta? Okay, so in this case we're saying here a beta of 1 means that the company's shares are as volatile as the market. If the beta is more than 1, they're more volatile than the market. And if they're less than 1, the beta, it means that they're less volatile than the market. Okay, so fairly straightforward there. Now, this is a question I think could come up. So what could change the beta? Okay, so what could actually influence beta? What could actually impact it? So what we need to know is that the beta that we're given within the pre-scene is what's known as a levered beta. Okay, so it incorporates business risk, which is the risk associated with the company's operations, and as well financial risk. Okay, so financial risk refers to the amount of leverage in the company's capital structure. And so if we have a situation where we maybe purchase a business in a different industry, that's going to lead to a different business risk, that's going to lead to a different beta. It may be the case that we're looking to fund that acquisition using debt, and that would have the effect of increasing financial risk. Okay, so these are the considerations that we should have in regards to changes or impacts to the beta. Okay, so some potential questions here. So the first is sources of finance. So what we have in terms of sources of finance, this is a very standard question: how the acquisition of a lithium mining company should be funded. Okay, so basically funding an acquisition. The next, evaluate the arguments for and against using an earn-out arrangement. Okay, so using an earn-out arrangement, should we use it, should we not use it? I suppose one of the main arguments for it is that it bridges what's known as a valuation gap. Okay, now the arguments against using an earn-out arrangement is it's not the only method that we can use. So when we're using an earn-out arrangement, we typically have to use debt and we have to use equity. Okay, so you can't just use earn-out arrangements in isolation. The next then, so recommend the approach Road should take to renegotiate its covenants. So this is a question that came up before in the past. So how do we renegotiate covenants? Well, basically you can threaten to restructure your capital. So when we're talking about going to another financial institution, raising debt with them, paying off our existing debt with new terms, we can threaten to do that. We can just do that. So that's a separate paragraph. You can possibly make a rational case that the business has changed, and as a result, you could possibly create a case for to the bank or the financial institution and say, well, we should change our thresholds because the nature of the business has changed, and possibly the investment that we're about to make with the debt is going to increase the value of the business, is going to increase profits, and so on and so forth. The next then is the dividend policy. So evaluate the implications of making a partial share repurchase. So this came up before for KCTP. Okay, so that was a past case study. Evaluate the implications of offering a scrip dividend instead of a cash dividend. Okay, so what are the implications of basically paying dividends in the form of shares instead of paying a cash dividend? Evaluate the pros and cons of issuing a dividend warning due to falling prices, or maybe just a lack of profits, because we had that profit decrease within the pre-scene. Okay, so I could see maybe a question around this. The next then is business valuation. So recommend how a selling price should be set for a mine that's to be divested. So basically what we're doing here is basically valuing a divestment. It's pretty much the same as valuing an acquisition. Okay, so how would we value a mine? Well, an asset-based valuation is probably going to give us the floor. Okay, so kind of the bare minimum. But actually in the case of a mine, you have a lot of hard assets, tangible assets. So this type of valuation methodology is actually not going to be the worst. And then we have the cash-based valuation, which is going to give us probably the most. So what will happen is probably the valuation will sit between those two. Okay, so it'll be on a spectrum between the two. Evaluate the challenges in valuing a AI-based mineral discovery company. So again, kind of a startup business, an awkward business to value. You could be given a question like that. That's happened a lot in the SCS exam. Evaluate the risks of over-valuing an acquisition target. Okay, so what are the risks of possibly paying too much for this acquisition target? The next then is the share price and efficient market hypothesis. So evaluate the effect that a cyber attack will have on Rhodomine's share price. Okay, so very simple type of question here, but how could you make your answer stand out? Talk about the short-term implications, which most students are going to do, but also talk about the long-term implications. So if, for example, the business does not rectify the situation, okay, so if it doesn't actually put in controls or make any long-term adjustments, then likely the share price is to kind of remain depressed, okay, because we're not actually making any changes, okay. So that could be something that you could talk about. And then, of course, as we said, if you're generating shareholder value in the long run, it's likely the case that you're going to have a share price increase. The next then, interpret a share price decrease following a bid to acquire an overseas sodium mine. The next, evaluate the significance of share price movements following a strategy debrief. This is something that's come up before in the past. So, evaluate the significance of share price movements. So why are they important? Okay, so in some cases, if you have a share price decrease, it may actually increase the cost of engaging in a share exchange if you're looking to acquire a business. So it may actually affect the viability of an acquisition. Okay, so beta. So the questions here are kind of limited, but evaluate the effect that acquiring a cybersecurity firm would have on beta. So again, you're engaging in new business risk. You're engaging in a different set of finance risk if you're looking to raise debt. Evaluate whether a big share price decline is consistent with Rhodomine's beta. That came up in the last set of exams. Okay, so basically what it was asking you is, if we had a big share price decline, is that in alignment? Is that consistent with the fact that our beta is greater than 1? Okay, and pretty much it is to a certain extent. Okay. Evaluate the effect that divesting a mine would have on the beta. Okay, so if we're losing operations, how would that affect the beta? And of course, the scenario is going to dictate your answer. Okay, so the worked examples. So Rhodomine's board have identified a potential acquisition target based in Portland. The target company is a sodium mining and extraction company with multiple mines outside of Portland. The board argued that ongoing development in sodium-ion battery technology makes this a logical acquisition. The acquisition is significant in size and it's expected to cost $900 million. Now, this is the question itself, the subtask as they call it. So evaluate the implications of foregoing this year's dividend in order to finance this acquisition. It's worth 50%. Okay, so we said before, for every 10% that's allocated, you should have, let's say, 1 paragraph. Okay, so it's a very rough rule. Okay, you don't always have to apply this, and in some situations it's not applicable, but in this case it is. Okay, so what are the implications of foregoing the dividend this year? So the first is gearing. So let's think about our gearing ratio. So if we pay a dividend, that has the effect of reducing our equity. So dividend comes out of the company's equity. Okay, and if we suspend the dividend payment, then equity will be higher than it would have been otherwise. Okay, and actually this company, Rhodomine, it pays a lot of its profits in dividends, which is something we're going to talk about in the next slide. So the effect of the suspension is that the gearing ratio is likely to reduce, which will increase the company's debt capacity. So it increases the amount of debt that we can possibly raise in the future. The reduction in gearing might be useful if we're looking to maybe raise debt and if we're subject to debt covenants. Okay, so if we're looking to raise debt for future projects. So the cost of capital, so if we forgo the dividend payment, that's going to increase the amount of equity in our capital structure. That then is going to lead to basically an increase in our cost of capital overall, our weighted average cost of capital, the WACC, because as we said, the cost of equity is more expensive than the cost of debt. So if we increase the amount of equity within our capital structure, that's going to increase the WACC, which is basically the average cost of capital across the two forms, so debt and equity. And that's something that, you know, will affect things like the appraisal of investments. So, you know, typically WACC is used when we're appraising investments. So as it says here, the main conclusion from this paragraph is that foregoing the dividend is going to have the effect of increasing the cost of capital. Okay, so the next one here, so the share price in the short term. So in the short term, yes, the share price is likely to drop as a result of foregoing the dividend because we paid out last year 89% of our 2024's profits in dividends, which is a huge amount. And if we're basically saying that we're not going to pay dividends this year, we're not going to meet the expectations of shareholders. So as a result, they're going to lose income, shareholders, that they would have likely planned for, okay? And this is going to be substantial for them. So it's likely the case that they may sell their shares and then move on to a different investment because they didn't get the dividends that they want, okay? In terms of signaling, so it may, and signaling is all about the message that this sends effectively, okay? So the difficulty with foregoing the dividend is that it results in an inconsistent dividend pattern. So it may actually create a lack of consistency, which shareholders tend to want. So, you know, different shareholders have different preferences. Some shareholders don't really care about dividends, some do, but all shareholders really kind of care about consistency, okay? So they're looking to invest in a stock or a share that's consistent in its dividend pattern. So for tax purposes, a lot of shareholders, they tend to have a preference for consistency rather than having volatile swings. So one year we've, you know, big dividends, one year we don't have dividends. Shareholders don't like that, okay? So foregoing the dividend creates the expectation that it could happen again if there's an attractive investment found, okay? So this may create the expectation that, well, if Rhodamine's board finds something that's attractive to invest in, they're just going to forgo the dividends, and that's not something that shareholders want. So the lack of consistency may result in the share price decreasing because existing shareholders may want more stability, therefore they sell their shares, move on to a different company. Okay, so in terms of the long run, so between 2023 and 2024, the net profits after tax, they reduced by 18%, which is something that you probably know from the pre-scene. Shareholders may already be expecting a kind of a suspension of dividends or lower dividends, okay? So this is kind of taking into consideration the pre-scene here. The expectation may dampen some of the share price decrease because they may already be expecting this. This may actually be incorporated within the share price. So over time, again, if the invested funds generate shareholder value, then the share price will increase, okay? So do we have any questions here? I just want to take a bit of water, okay, which is badly needed. Okay, so we're about to go on to core activity D. So I see there's some questions here. Okay, so I definitely seem to struggle with ethics and sustainability questions when it comes to the wording. Yeah, I agree. Like questions around sustainability and questions around ethics. The new questions that have come out with ethics in the most recent set of exam papers were a little bit awkward. They're a bit strange, to be honest with you. So ethics is something we're actually going to cover in this particular core activity D, which a lot of students don't like, if I'm honest with you. So yes, this is something that we're going to cover off. Does anyone have any questions just while I'm here, while I'm trying to recover for the next core activity? Might be a good idea to ask me any questions. Maybe you can hear my dog in the background walking about the place. We have a golden retriever, so you can probably hear him going about on our wooden floors. Okay, so okay, question. No, it's completely fine. Not a silly question at all. So, only prepare for exam this weekend. Can I still pass the November exam? My question to you is, can you still book the November exam? So if you have a booked, you know what, I'm going to say to you that you can pass it. And the reason why I say that is because for some cohorts that I've done in the past, instead of them studying for, you know, several weeks, what has happened is the arrangement that the company that I was working with, or it wasn't a company, it was Cima, is instead of having you know, let's say a few weeks to study for the exam, they use full days. So they use, let's say, 4 or 5 full days, and that can actually be, I have seen this in the past, that can be enough to pass the exam, but they're quite intensive days. So what I would say to you is, if you have a run of like a few days where you know you're going to just be studying, yes, I think it is possible, but you have it booked. Okay, I'm not trying to upsell you, but if you do need help with this, I really recommend buying my course and talking to me, because it's tricky to pass the exam. I'll be honest with you, with that much time, but it is possible, and I've been in a position where students had this limited time before and they have passed the exam, but this was with a different type of program where it was like intensive days. So if you have study leave, yeah, it's possible. If you have clear days where you can study, yes, it's possible. If you're only doing like a few hours here and there, it would be tough. Okay, it'd be difficult, just being honest with you. But this might be, again, look, to be honest, maybe reach out to me privately. If you have my email, it's hugh@proaccountancy.com. Okay, so if you go on the Pro Accountancy website, there's a contact form as well, but it's hugh@proaccountancy.com if you want to talk to me about this. Okay, see, maybe we come up with a strategy for passing the exam together. Okay, so does anyone else have any questions before I go on to core activity D? There's so many people in this, right? So this is great. It's great to see. And hopefully you guys are finding this useful. I know I'm kind of going through things quite quickly, but there's a lot of material here. Okay, so there's like 80 slides or something, right? So this is like massive. Okay. And just again, if anyone is interested, I know the exam is kind of coming up. We're not at the moment selling mock marking services, but basically what I'm doing is I'm kind of like selling the course, components of the course separately, and doing it all manually. So if you are looking for mocks and mock marking, maybe you're kind of thinking, okay, I need to just kind of practice my skills, please reach out to me privately and we'll see what we can do. Okay, so I am coming up with a product, but it takes a while to put this onto the website. So I work with a developer is my friend, and it can take some time to kind of change the website and do it right. I could put up something, but it would look terrible. I just don't want to do that. So I tried to make it look good. Okay, so any other questions before I head on? Okay, there doesn't seem to be any. Okay, so core activity D. So core activity D is another kind of big one, and to be honest with you, it's not the worst, but it's kind of one of these ones where you get questions where they're typically quite hard to answer and quite hard to understand. So core activity D, and I'm going to go a bit slower because I'm conscious that I tend to speak quite quickly. So that's my accent and where I'm from. People talk really quickly, but I've been told before in the past I need to slow it down a little bit because sometimes some of the words I'm saying people can't understand. So core activity D. So evaluate and mitigate risk. So it's all about P3. So if you've gone through the traditional route and maybe you're aware of P3, or if you're an FLPer, basically it's risk management. Okay, so if you've gone through that part of your FLP platform. So what is this? This is I can evaluate risks and recommend responses. I can maintain the corporate risk register. Okay, so risk register is principal risk report. I can identify ethical dilemmas and recommend suitable responses. Huge part of the syllabus, ethics. So Alex, you mentioned ethics, and you're totally right to bring it up because this is tested over and over and over and over again. And to be honest, it's not the worst. It's just the way the questions are phrased is a little bit awkward sometimes. I can evaluate and mitigate cyber risks. So this is a big area, and I can recommend internal controls. This is one where it comes up every now and again, and to be honest, it's kind of a rotten one. Okay, so the key areas here that we need to be aware of. So the first is ethics, and ethics is tested all the time. Okay, so very, 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 very high likelihood that there will be at least one variant that has an ethics question on it. There'll probably be 2 or 3. Okay, so in the last one I think there was 2, or maybe there was 3. Okay, and basically the questions are pretty straightforward, but it's the way they're phrased, and sometimes the scenarios that you're given can be a little bit strange. So typically what you're asked to do is to evaluate if a certain action or if a certain strategy or a proposal or situation is ethical or not. Okay, and what Cima will do is they will typically give you situations that you may have an emotional attachment to. And so let's say, for example, it's like redundancies. Okay, so we all think, firing staff, offering redundancies, it's a kind of a negative thing for a lot of people. And, that makes sense. If you've ever been made redundant, it's a horrible process. And so really what Cima are doing is they're trying to test, can you work through a situation logically using the principles from the Code of Ethics rather than using your own sort of emotions to determine whether something is ethical or not. So what you're asked to do typically is to apply the principles. Okay, so apply the principles from the Cima Code of Ethics. So there's 5 principles. You really need to know them for this exam. Okay, if I was going to say, learn off something, and when we say learn off, I mean like memorize something, I would recommend that you memorize the principles from the Cima Code of Ethics. Okay, so the first is integrity. This means being straightforward and honest, pretty straightforward, pardon the pun. Objectivity, so this is where basically we don't allow bias to influence our decisions. Okay, so the undue influence of others. Professional behavior is all about abiding by the law. Okay, so that's basically what it's all about. Confidentiality is keeping information that we've gained through a professional relationship confidential and disclosing it if we have a professional obligation or a legal obligation to do so. And the last one, professional competence and due care, is all about making sure that you have the appropriate skills as an accountant or a professional to carry out your duties. Now, this last one is very rarely applicable to a ethical dilemma, and something that I need to stress here is that the examiner has said that typically poor quality answers for ethics-based questions either don't use the Cima code of ethics, or they use this approach where we have all the principles being used and actually only a handful are actually applicable. Okay, so just use the ones that are applicable. Don't just have all the principles and then kind of try and fit the scenario around that. So the next thing is ethical arguments. So you may have a question that says, give the ethical arguments for and against a certain decision. And this is a new type of question that Cima have started to examine. It is actually possible to incorporate the code of ethics within this question. So let's say, for example, we have an argument for, you could say, well, it's in alignment with integrity, it's in alignment with objectivity, and here are the reasons why. But actually the arguments against, it's against professional behavior and confidentiality. Okay, so you can incorporate that Cima code of ethics within your answer. And I know some of you may be thinking, well, Hugh, you said, on your groups and stuff, like don't use models and everything. If you're going to use anything, I would suggest use the Cima code of ethics, because in the marking grids, typically they will require you to use the principles. So the marking grids will be split up into the different principles. So did you use a principle? If you did use it, you get a certain number of marks. Did you explain it? Did you evaluate it? You get more marks, and so on and so forth. Okay, so internal control. So internal control, kind of a weird area. It's not tested loads, even though you would think, because it's such a big topic for P3, that it would be tested lots. Typically questions around internal controls are around recommending controls. So come up with some controls to prevent this situation from occurring again. So for Rhodomine, could be the case that we have, let's say, a cyber attack and we have to come up with some controls to prevent it from occurring again. You may have a situation where we have an accident in a mine, come up with some controls to prevent this from occurring again. So the controls that you recommend have to be very scenario specific. So there's not much I can really give here without having a scenario built out for you. But when you're thinking about controls, try and think about these areas. So supervision, so these are the different types of controls that you can have. So making sure there's supervision. Let's say it's a mine where we have an accident that's occurred. We need to make sure that there's some form of supervision going on to kind of prevent this from occurring again. Authorization, okay, so basically, putting authorization into a process tends to increase the amount of control over that process. So let's say, for example, we have a mine and we have an incident report, which basically logs all of the incidents that have occurred. Basically, you could have authorization controls where we only actually remove that incident from the report if there is authorization to do so. And this basically ensures that all the safety risks are being looked at, they're being reviewed, and so on. The next then, physical controls. So physical controls are about barriers and basically restricting access to certain areas of the business. So that could be, putting up walls, barriers, turnstiles, and so on and so forth. Management. So management controls are about making sure that objectives are being completed. So what we're doing here is things like performance appraisals. So with the mines are managed locally. So in terms of controls, management controls, having performance appraisals is really important. So looking at the results that the mines are generating and actually following up and seeing, is the mine doing what it should be doing in terms of performance? Okay, so that's what a management control is. Organization controls is basically all about roles and the structure of the business. Okay, so making sure that there's the appropriate roles within the business, that they're clear, there's clear remit, and so on and so forth. The next then is the impact on the control environment. And this is something that actually falls more under core activity E. Okay, so it's something we'll cover off in core activity E, but sometimes it's tested under core activity D. Okay, so we will cover it off. I kind of put it in both just so that you're aware. The next then is the appointment of a risk manager. So should we appoint a risk manager or should we not? This is basically testing whether you understand what a risk manager is. So a risk manager basically takes kind of an operational role They identify risk within the business. They come up with risk management strategies. They try to ensure that the business is abiding by regulations. They deal with insurance providers. So that's really the role of a risk manager. What's the drawback of having a risk manager? You might think, well, there's a cost, okay? And the other one is that it can create complacency within the business among operational level staff. So they may think, look, we have a risk manager. I don't need to care about risk because this guy will sort it out for me. Okay, so that can happen within a business. And really, that's a bad culture to have. You want to make sure that everyone is kind of risk conscious within the business. The next then is risk reporting. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward and has been tested a lot, but there's often a lot of confusion among students. So this would be quite useful to you. So principal risk report is within the pre-scene document. This is a report that's given to stakeholders. So it's an external report, okay? And basically what it does is it contains all the high level risks of the business. And the reason why this is within the pre-scene is because in the UK, companies over a certain size and listed companies have to have a disclosure of the main risks that they face and how the company is addressing those risks. And that's called a principal risk report. So that's why you typically have it within your pre-scene, because the people who are writing these pre-scenes are in the United Kingdom. So that's why. Now you may have a question about whether to add new risks. Okay, so again, a lower level answer would say, yeah, that's brilliant. Let's add more risks. Good idea. But actually, when you think about it, it's not such a good idea sometimes, because if we're adding risks that are not that material, it actually devalues the report, because the more risks we have on it, the more we're saying that actually the other risks are not as important. So really, we should only be adding risks that are highly important, okay, highly material for the business. You could have a question whether a risk should have been added. So something happens like a cyber attack in our case, and if you look back at the pre-scene, you notice there's no mention of cyber risk. So should a cyber risk, disclosure, should that have been made? And the answer there is, yeah, probably yes, okay? So there's obviously more detail you would add there to your answer, but that's effectively the answer. Risk register. So the risk register is a lot more detailed. It's an internal document. So some of you may actually work with the risk register. I know I used to when I worked in management accounting. And basically a risk register, it contains all the risks that the business faces. It's highly detailed. It's typically a spreadsheet. Contains the risk owner, the date it was identified, the mitigation strategies, the score that it has, which is like a prioritization score, follow-up actions, all that kind of stuff. Okay, there is no like set format for a risk register. Those are just some common details. So you may have a question about adding new risks to the register, removing risks. So do we remove a risk because it's no longer relevant? That could happen within the exam. Misclassifying risks. This came up before in the past as something that I thought Cima would test a lot more. So this is a question that came up in the prototype paper, which was the first paper that Cima drafted when they changed the syllabus in 2019. And what basically happened was there was a risk register, and the risk register said this risk is really not important, and then the risk actually happened, and then there was a big, drama in the business, okay? And the question was basically saying, should we have prioritized this risk a little bit higher? And I suppose this question, could have come up in your exam. Not like that, I would imagine, but you could have a question where basically there's maybe a query as to why something like cyber risk was not disclosed within the company's principal risk report. So we basically misclassified the risk. We didn't really understand it. Maybe we didn't mention it for a certain reason. That could happen. So the next thing is cyber risk. So evaluating cyber risks, evaluating cybersecurity solutions. This comes up every now and again where basically you're given a company, like a cybersecurity consultancy company, they give you a list of solutions and you have to basically evaluate them. So is this going to help us? Penetration testing, firewalls, encryption, is that actually going to address the problems that we have? The next then, implications of cyber attacks. So what are the implications? What will this do to the business? So share price, for example, possibly it's going to, in the case of Rhodamine, lead to enhanced risk management for this particular area, enhanced internal controls, and so on. The next then is cybersecurity objectives. So this came up before in one paper and it was tested twice on the same paper, and it's just a really weird question, but it is important to be aware of. So these are the objectives that you should have for cybersecurity, and where these came from that Cima used them. These come from the AICPA's SOC 2. Now you don't need to know loads of information about this, but basically AICPA, which is obviously the body that Cima is joined up with for the Cima qualification, the CGMA designation, they published this system called SOC 2, which is basically an audit that's carried out on a company, and you can publish this audit report that basically says that the company's cybersecurity measures are robust, okay? and it's for service organizations. And within that, there's a thing called the trust services criteria, which are the objectives that you should have for cybersecurity. So that's where Cima got them from. They got them from the AICPA SOC 2. So is that information totally useful? Not really. Okay, so this is basically the objectives that you should have for cybersecurity. So the first is security, which is referring to basically preventing unauthorized access to a system. Availability is about ensuring that the system is constantly available for the right people. Processing integrity is ensuring that system processing is done in a valid way. The next is confidentiality, so keeping information confidential. And the next is privacy. And the difference between privacy and confidentiality is that privacy is about user data. So data that's specific to users, and making sure that it's stored and processed in alignment with privacy rules. So GDPR, for example, or whatever equivalent you have in your country. So I'm conscious it's an international audience, okay? So the next thing is integrated reporting. Now, integrated reporting typically comes under core activity D. I have no idea why, if I'm being honest with you, but it is mapped to core activity D, and therefore it's something that could come up in your exam. It has in the past. It's actually been tested several times. I think it's highly applicable to this particular case. So typically the questions will ask you, what impact will a certain decision have on the capital? So within an integrated report, you have a series of capitals, and basically these are stores of value that change depending on what the company does. Now, it's just important to note here that, within the actual integrated reporting framework, the capitals that are used that Cima suggest, they are suggested within the integrated report. However, you can actually have different capitals. Okay, so the integrated reporting framework says these are just a template. You can actually have different capitals as well. But these are the 6 main ones. So the first is financial. So this is financial stores of capital. So things like short-term cash and also long-term capital. Okay, the next then is manufactured. So these are basically the assets that we use to carry out the operations of the business. So buildings, equipment, that kind of stuff. Social and relationships. So these are basically things like the company's social license to operate. Okay, so what relationships do we have? Stakeholders. Okay, so social, what social relationships do we have with other organizations? So if we're partnering with another organization, that's likely to increase this capital. Human, so what skills do we have? So competencies, capabilities within the organization, and as well motivation. So things like motivation to work in the business and to adhere to the company's values. Intellectual capital, so here we're talking about things like tacit knowledge, also IP, so things like brands, intellectual property, something that you would see recorded within the financial statements. And then natural capital, so here we're talking about natural resources that we use within our operations, and this is highly relevant to road mine because obviously we use water, rocks, or that kind of stuff. Now, you have questions sometimes about repairing the capital. So when something has happened, we can have a negative influence on the capital. So let's say, for example, we have an environmental effect that's caused damage to the local area. That can actually take away value from the capital. So how do we repair them? And that's going to be scenario specific, but it could be, for example, reaching out to our stakeholders, saying that we're going to fix the issue. Okay, so actually physically carrying out repairs to the land or whatever it is that we need to do in order to kind of, recover whatever we've damaged. That's going to, increase things like social relationship. It's probably going to increase things like natural capital. So we're restoring the land or whatever it is. So, again, we need to think about repairing capitals as well as the impact of the capitals. So let's look at some potential questions here. So the first is ethics. Now, there's a huge range of questions you could get here on ethics. I'm not going to say I can predict it perfectly, but let's say, for example, you could have questions, evaluate the ethical implications of lobbying governments. This is a popular one. You could have a situation where we're trying to lobby a government for mining rights, putting pressure on governments, okay, making payments to governments. So possibly there's a question where, we're kind of deciding, is it bribery or is this like a kind of a cultural norm? That could be kind of a question that comes up. Concealing discovery information. So maybe it's the case that actually we discovered there's a lithium in a certain country, and actually we're trying to conceal this information in order to kind of keep prices high for lithium. So maybe there's a risk that if we disclose this information that it's going to decrease the price, and we want to maybe ride the wave of having high prices for a certain period of time. So is that right? Is that wrong? Making redundancies, again, that's one that has come up before in the past. Greenwashing. So greenwashing is where we kind of manufacture our results, our sustainability reports, to make it seem like we're more environmentally friendly than we are. So companies do this in the real world. It's come up before in the past as well. So, the implications of greenwashing, what should we do in relation to this? that kind of thing. Okay, so internal controls. So recommending internal controls around cyber attacks, as we said, health and safety, legal obligations, so that the legal obligations that the business has. Evaluate the effect on the control environment of a director resigning. This is more of a core activity E area, but it could be tested on a core activity D as well. Evaluate the effect of appointing a risk manager for a newly acquired company. So, what we're talking about here is this appropriate? Is this a way of managing risks with that company? Okay, so that could be a question that pops up. It actually came up in the past. Risk reporting. So recommend how the risk of bribery should be recorded within the risk register. So how should it be recorded? Do we put in, what information should we put in? We should have a risk owner. So someone should be actually looking after this risk. We should have a date of identification, follow-up action, a risk score. So the score is kind of a way of prioritizing the risk within the risk register. So those are the kind of answers you should have. Evaluate the board's rationale for leaving cyber risk off the principal risk report. So this is an interesting question. I think it could be tested where basically the board says that they left the risk off because they were worried that if they had the risk on the principal risk report, it would suggest that the company places reliance on cyber. And as a result, then cyber criminals might see this as a potential opportunity and they may hack the business. Now, there was a similar type of question before where basically information was not disclosed in the principal risk report because competitors may get an advantage. Okay, so again, you could have a similar type of scenario just with cyber risk. And that's what Cima like to do. They like to kind of take a question and change the way it's been phrased, but not necessarily change the topic. Okay, so just change the way in which it's testing students. Evaluate the disclosure of protester action on the principal risk report. So should we disclose this? Is it worth disclosing? And that's really testing students on their knowledge of the principal risk report. So hopefully you'll do well in that type of question. Recommend the board's role in helping to achieve cybersecurity objectives. So what should the board be doing? Should they be appointing new board members? Should they be restructuring the business? Think about things like internal controls. They should be getting internal audit to check any internal controls if there are any. They should be getting maybe the new risk manager or maybe operational level staff to create controls, so on and so forth. Evaluate the effectiveness of proposed cybersecurity measures. So maybe you have, again, a series of measures that have been suggested by a company. We have to evaluate them. Recommend how to prevent potential social engineering attacks. So this has actually come up before. You may have a variant of this where it says, look, how do we prevent phishing attacks or ransomware? Often it comes down to things like training, also having system controls, things like firewalls, encryption, keeping information secure. For example, don't put your password on a piece of paper and put it on top of your laptop. Those types of things. Okay. Integrated reporting. So recommend how the use of direct lithium extraction will be disclosed in the company's integrated report. So how will that affect the capitals? So it's probably going to have a positive effect on our natural capitals, probably going to increase our reputation, that kind of stuff, but may have a negative impact on our financial capital. Recommend how specific capitals can be repaired after a brine leakage. So maybe there's brine that leaks out into the environment, causes damage. How could we repair those capitals? Evaluate the difficulties. This came up before. This is a really tough question. The difficulties in reporting changes to various capitals. So maybe there's a situation that is hard to kind of determine whether it will increase capitals or decrease. So let's say, for example, we lobby the government and actually we were successful in our lobbying attempt. We put a lot of pressure on them. It's kind of hard to determine how that will affect certain capitals because yes, it was a victory, but have we kind of ruined our relationship with the government? Okay, if we put a lot of pressure on them, depending on the nature of the lobbying. So, that kind of question could come up. It came up before. It was a very niche question, to be honest with you, but it's a variant, I suppose, of a kind of integrated reporting question. So let's look at a worked example. So in the country of Eastland, there's an environmental protection authority and they've identified an issue. So one of Rhoda brine mines, which is in this fictional country, has extracted too much water, which has led to damage to the local ecosystem. So an indigenous community that uses nearby land for farming is planning to take legal action against Rhoda mine. So in return for not pursuing legal action, the board is proposing to offer to the community this offer. Okay, so the offer states that Rhoda mine will give the community 2% of profits earned from the mine annually over 10 years. Evaluate whether the board's offer to the indigenous community is ethical. Okay, so it's worth 40%. So this is a very standard question, 40% to 50%, evaluate whether this is ethical or not. Okay, so the weak level answers here, the ones that would do terrible, and I'm just being honest, are the ones that wouldn't use the Cima code of ethics. So likely it's the case that the marking grids have 3 principles or 2 principles, and did you apply the principle if you explain the principle, you get a certain number of marks. If you actually applied it, if you applied it with detail, you get certain, a different level of marks. Okay, so in this particular case, is it ethical? Is it not? Well, what we should do is we should basically use our principles, okay, to determine whether it's ethical or not just kind of jump to a conclusion straight away. So the first one that I would do here is integrity, and with these principles, explain what they are first. Okay, so it's really straightforward. Acting with integrity means being honest and straightforward in professional relationships. So you have the first sentence there done. Okay, the next is, in this instance, whether integrity is maintained, it depends on the way in which the offer is presented. So think about the actual principle itself. What does it say? Honesty. Okay, so if it's the case that we're being honest, then yes, it's in alignment. If it's the case that we're not being honest, then it's not. Okay, so if it's made clear that the offer is being made to compensate for the damage caused, then yes, integrity is maintained. Now you could say it's not, perfect, but if we're saying actually we caused damage, here's a payment. Okay, here's compensation. Yes, we did it. But it is important to remember here that Rhodamine will be taking ownership of the damage caused if they do that. Okay, so that's kind of a side point. If the reason for the payment is not made in an honest fashion, then the principle is violated. Okay, so if we lie about the payment for whatever reason, or however we do that, then that's not in alignment with integrity. So objectivity. So this means not allowing bias, conflict of interest, or the influence of other people to override your professional judgment. Now, this is one where people go wrong on all the time. So what's the board's primary responsibility? It's to maximize shareholder value or shareholder wealth. So making the offer is likely to reduce reputational damage, and overall it's likely the case that it's going to have a reduced financial impact. Otherwise there'd be no point in making it. Okay, so it's probably the best financial outcome for the business. So in this regard, the board is making an offer in an objective fashion. However, and this is how you get more content inside your ethics answers, if the board made the offer in an attempt to repair personal relationships, then that would breach objectivity. So let's say, for example, we have a board member that's maybe a part of this community, and maybe they're making the payment as kind of a sympathy, or maybe they feel like, well, we should do this because we know these people, these people live near us and so on and so forth. They have a relationship with them. That's not objectivity. Okay, we're thinking here about the financial outcome, and it seems to be the best for the business. Okay, if it is, and then we've put that in our answer. Professional behavior. So professional behavior means complying with relevant laws and regulations. In many countries, it's legal to make an arrangement like this that the board is proposing, where basically you say, we'll make you a payment if you don't pursue legal action against us, or if you have an out of court settlement. So that's important to note. But however, it is also important to note that the company may still have legal implications for the treatment towards the environment. So the fact that we've caused environmental damage likely means that we're going to have some legal implications from the government or from this Environmental Protection Agency. And if we've effectively taken responsibility for this, then yes, we're likely to have some form of legal ramifications. But in this case, so if the offer is being made in a coercive fashion, again, we're taking the opposite approach, then it would likely constitute a violation of this ethical principle because it wouldn't be legal. Okay, so what I've done here is I've used 3 ethical principles. Okay, so in this case it was worth 40%, so you don't have to necessarily use 4 principles, because does confidentiality really relate to this? Not really. Okay, so the examiner has said please use the principles that are relevant. Okay, don't just use all of them, or kind of put in as many as use the ones that are relevant. Okay, so in this case I can be at peace with the fact that I just had 3 paragraphs, even though it's worth 40%, because the examiner has said in the past use the principles that are relevant. Okay, so the next few questions I just want to see here, this and please feel free to put in questions. So there's one here, will internal controls be applicable to society and social groups, environmental, natural and protest groups? Sort of. So like, let's say for example you have like a protest or something, right, and it's like an environmental protest where the mine is stormed. Okay, so let's say a load of protesters go into a brine mine and they just destroy the place. You may be asked the question, what controls should we have in place to prevent this from occurring again? And you could think about something like physical controls, physical barriers, possibly having things like controls around scanning what's going on social media. Okay, so maybe there's a manager that basically they have every week to kind of report back to the board about what's going on in the environment, the external environment, in terms of potential risks in regards to protesters possibly coming into Rhodamine and causing damage. So maybe you could, in theory, to answer your question, Is there any other question here? I'm just going to get a small bit of water, which is badly needed, I think. Hopefully you guys can understand me. I know I'm losing my voice here very, very rapidly. So if anyone has any other questions, okay, cool. So I was thinking about Greenpeace taking some extreme protests to put themselves in physical danger. Yeah, I mean, that was what that kind of past scenario was about. Okay, so the one that I'm referring to was basically there was protesters who blocked a road. Okay, so like blocked a road to a factory or something like that. So I think Cima kept it pretty simple, but yeah, it's the same type of thing, isn't it? They put themselves in harm's way. And the question that was examined on that was, should those protesters be recognised as stakeholders and repairing the damage done to the company's reputation, which isn't really controls based, but could you have questions on controls? Yeah, you could. I mean, if I was creating a mock paper, it would be possible to have, recommend controls or, recommend what we should do in regards to, let's say this action, in terms of controls. What controls could we put in place to prevent this from occurring? So, yeah, it's possible. It's possible, yeah. Okay, so let's get stuck into core activity E. Okay, so core activity E is, it's pretty straightforward. To be honest with you, it's one that I like a lot. Okay, I think it's one where you can actually pick up marks. Tends to be the case that you get questions at the end of your paper on core activity E. If you look at the last few exam papers, I want to answer this question here. So could political risk, just so that, because this is related to what I just talked about. So could political risk and mitigation techniques be highly examinable due to new US election? No. So this exam was drafted last year. It's probably drafted 18 months ago. So what would be relevant in this exam is probably, if you want to talk about, current events and stuff, what would be relevant here is the Inflation Reduction Act, which was signed in the United States, which had the effect of increasing the amount of lithium being mined in the United States. So at present, right, so this is kind of an interesting fact, there's only one lithium mine in the US, and it's in Nevada. And you would think in America there'd be loads of lithium mines because there is loads of lithium, but actually there's only one. And the Inflation Reduction Act has made it easier for companies to extract lithium, and it's created a kind of prioritization for American companies to engage in lithium extraction and electric vehicle manufacturing. So to answer your question there, Stefana, this paper was drafted so long ago that wouldn't have been taken into consideration, no. Okay, so core activity E. So core activity E is really simple, okay? To be honest, it's kind of just a few topics. Now, students hate these topics, but I do think that the questions are super limited, okay? So if you can kind of master these questions, you will do really well in core activity E. So recommend and maintain a sound control environment, so between 15 to 25%. If you haven't noticed, they're all 15 to 25%. So I can apply internal audit resources. So this is one that people hate with a passion, and I can understand because often it's the case, let's just be honest, if you're Cima qualified, you're probably not working as an internal auditor, so your knowledge of what they do is based on what you see in books or what you see other people doing rather than what you do at work. There are people that work in internal audit that are Cima qualified, but it's not common, okay, just being honest. The next then is I can recommend appropriate controls and evaluate implications of compliance failures. This one is like an overlap of internal controls, but basically it's talking about the control environment, okay, so it's a little bit different. And the next one then, I can recommend responses to the threats arising from poor governance. This is testing you on corporate governance, okay, so very simple. So key theory coverage, so internal audit, okay. Now the reason why I've included this is because internal audit comes up all the time. And if you look at the last set of exam papers, you'll see I think it was tested 4 times, okay, so it was tested in 4 variants or 3 variants. It was tested a lot, so you really should know internal audit very well, okay. So what should you know, though, in regards to internal audit, because it's a big topic? Well, the first is the use of internal audit. So questions may ask you, what's the arguments for, what's the arguments against using internal audit? So when you get questions like this, I don't like telling students, learn this answer, by rote and then use this in the real exam. But often it's the case that you can repeat points. Let's just be real here, okay? So if you have a question that says, should we use internal audit for this investigation, or is it appropriate, that's come up before, to use internal audit? Think about this. So the first is skills, okay? So internal audit have investigation skills. So often it's the case when they're carrying out work to do with investigations. Let's say it's investigating if there was an internal fraud within the business. That's occurred before. Yes, they have those investigation skills, okay? So it is often the case that they have enough skill to carry out an audit or an investigation. However, they typically don't have specialized expertise in certain technical areas of the business. So for example, if we have a cyber attack and we've asked internal audit to carry out kind of a report or a review of what happened and what were the weaknesses, they may not necessarily have the technical expertise to carry out a detailed review of what specifically happened from a technical perspective. So that's a limitation of using internal audit. The next is independence. So one of the main benefits of using internal audit is that they're independent, okay? So they're not necessarily like operational level staff that have, independence compromised because they have, a financial tie to the business and they have a manager that's also in an operational level role. Internal audit's a little bit different because they report into the audit committee. So they don't necessarily have the same level of kind of compromised independence. Now, internal audit independence is not perfect, but it is one of the main benefits of using internal audit for an investigation is that it has credibility because they are to a degree independent. Now, here's where you can enhance your answer. You can say, well, in some situations, it may be more appropriate to use external auditors because arguably they have more independence. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, well, you pay an external auditor, so they're not fully independent. That's true, but you're never going to get 100% independence. Generally speaking, you have more independence with an external auditor than you do an internal auditor, okay? But that may be something you can use to enhance your answer. And as well, sometimes external auditors have specialized experience in certain things like sustainability, cyber risk, and so on. So, like the Big Four, for example, they would have expertise, auditors that would carry out what they call assurance audits, where they would carry out an audit into something like a sustainability report rather than, just financial statements. So capacity is another one that's interesting. So if you're asked, is it appropriate to use internal audit? You can always say, well, internal audit typically work to an annual audit plan that's approved in advance, and that audit plan would have different things that auditor would, or that auditing team would have to do. And so if we say to them, you need to carry out this special investigation, that's going to cause problems in terms of capacity. So it may actually push back that plan. We may not actually have the capacity to carry out that task. So that's something we need to consider. The next, and this is a really popular question, is the work performed by internal audit. So you may be given a situation or a scenario where we're asked, what would internal audit be tasked with? What would they do in this particular case? Okay, and what's this testing you on? It's testing you on your knowledge of internal audit and what they actually do day to day. So let's say, for example, we have a training program, okay? And the training program is maybe it's been created because Rhodamine had an accident in one of the mines, okay? So possibly someone slipped, fell, there was a big injury, and now we've come up with this new training program, and it's there to basically prevent this from occurring again. And possibly the question says, recommend the work that the internal audit team would do to ensure that this training is effective. This type of question is so common. So what type of work would they perform? Well, let's say in this case, they would compare the training manual to the objectives that the board set for the training. So they're doing that comparing role. They're saying, okay, is the training that we're actually carrying out, is the materials or whatever we're using, are they effective, or is it in alignment with the objectives that have been set by the board? So that's the first thing. The next thing is checking. So they're checking to see, are people actually doing the training within the business? So they would look at logs, maybe attendance records. Maybe if it's online training, they would look at an online record of whether people are actually going through the training. Interviewing, so this is a skill set of internal auditors actually carrying out an interview of various different staff, checking to see, do they actually understand what has been put forward in the training. And the next thing is reviewing. So maybe in that case, you could be reviewing incident reports and seeing, if accidents have occurred, are the accidents related to things that the training should be addressing? Okay, so we're checking to see, again, is that training actually effective? The last one there could fit under corporate governance, to be honest with you, but it's something that I think is important from an internal audit perspective because in the past, they've been tested together. The role of the audit committee. So this is one that typically students struggle with. It has not been tested much, so I think it could come up in your exam paper. So audit committee, what does it do? It basically selects, recommends the external auditor, and it makes sure that that external auditor is independent. As well, they have a role in basically reviewing the high-level accounting policies of the company, so making sure that the financial statements are reflecting a fair representation of the company's financial performance. The audit committee in this case as well has basically a leadership role over the internal audit department, and they would typically be involved in appraising or evaluating the effectiveness of internal audit. Okay, so that's the role of the audit committee. So corporate governance, now this is a huge lesson. I actually have a lesson in my course on corporate governance that's about 50 minutes long, and the reason why is because it's just such a big area, okay, within the syllabus. So if you've done P3, you'll know that corporate governance is massive, and it's highly testable for all precincts, okay, so really, really, really testable subject. So sometimes you get questions on the paper about the impact of poor governance. So, has this event occurred because of poor governance? And, how do you approach a question like that? Well, you think about things like internal controls, risk management. Did we have the appropriate board skills to address that particular problem? So think about governance issues. When I think about governance, I think of board skills, board composition, remit, risk management, internal control, those types of things, okay? The next then is the role of executive directors and non-executive directors. So Cima tend to test this every now and again just to check and see do students really understand the difference between the two. So, an an executive director is basically there to set the strategy, set the values of the business. They're there normally to have some form of operational remit. So you'll have, let's say, a CFO, a chief financial officer. They would have responsibility for the treasury team, the financial reporting team, in some businesses, even technology. Okay, so that's not the case in Rhodamine, but that can be the case in the real world. And then you have the non-executive directors. So what do they do? And often students don't really understand the role of a non-executive director. Basically, they are there to challenge the board, okay? So they're there as an overseer. It's to prevent groupthink effectively, okay? So the non-executive directors are there to advocate on behalf of the shareholders and to basically challenge the board to say, look, I don't think this is correct. Actually, I think maybe we should be doing this. So that's basically what the role of a non-executive director is. They basically protect shareholders' interests, and that's where the role of a non-executive director came from. All these controversies were happening in the US and the UK with companies where there was like one person controlling everything, and that's where this whole concept of non-executive directors came from. Then the role of the board in general, and what we're talking about here is the responsibility that the board should take if events occur. This has been tested before about, how, let's say, for example, there's a cyber attack, okay? What's the board's responsibility here? Let's say the cyber attack was due to maybe a manager within Rhodamine. Maybe they gave someone, their details, and as a result, they logged in, and there was a cyber attack. Is the board responsible for that? And actually, yes, the board as a whole has a responsibility for everything in the company, okay? Even though they delegate that responsibility, they still have ultimate accountability and responsibility for everything that occurs in the business. However, you can say in your answer that yes, they delegate that responsibility to a certain extent. So although they must accept in order to have a good control environment, everything that happens, there's limitations to a certain extent as to what they can do, okay? Because they have limited capacity. So in terms of other questions that could come up here, appointing executive directors, that's come up a lot. So whether it's appropriate to appoint an executive director, worth noting here that you should typically have an equal balance between non-executive directors and executive directors. And actually the UK Code of Corporate Governance, the 2024 edition, says that actually the chair shouldn't be involved in that. So if you are appointing another executive director, it furthers that imbalance, which is a sign of poor corporate governance on the board. There are benefits, though, obviously, of having additional executive directors. So if we have, for example, a sustainability director, it shows the markets that we care about that issue. Possibly we've had controversies and now we're appointing this director in order to solve those issues. There's a cost, so that's a negative. There's a cost associated. And if you think about a company like Rhodamine, it's had a decrease in its profits. And then what are we doing? We're appointing these big expensive directors. So, think about the perception to the markets about that. Is that really going to increase value, for the company? Maybe not. Okay, so that's something to bring into your answer. Non-executive directors as well, really important to consider non-executive directors, the appointment of them. Is it a good idea to have, additional non-executive directors on the board? Yes, tends to be the case. However, you may be given a situation where there's a question that says, should we appoint a non-executive director with specific expertise in cyber risk? Because we don't have that within the business, that expertise in cyber risk. And actually that's quite an interesting question, because a lot of students would say, yes, good idea. Again, kind of the quick answer. However, think about this. If you have a non-executive director with cybersecurity experience, there's a risk that they become operationally responsible for cyber risk, because everyone will ask them questions about cyber risk. They'll say, Director X, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And over time, there's an expectation that they will become responsible for cyber risk. And that's going to impede their independence. And that is why for large organizations, you will see non-executive directors coming from completely unrelated industries. So for example, Walmart, if you look at the non-executive directors for Walmart, they had like Hillary Clinton at one stage, they had the, Melissa Myers, they had, the ex-CEO of Yahoo, people that are completely unrelated to grocery retail, okay? So this is why, because they're independent. Okay, so next is board committees. So the establishment of new board committees. This can happen, okay, so it's come up lots in the exam. The creation of a sustainability committee, is that a good idea? The creation of a technology committee, an ethics committee. This happens in the real world, so people make committees beyond the normal 4 that are suggested within the UK Code of Corporate Governance. So for example, is it a good idea to have a sustainability committee? Yes, to a certain extent, because it allows you to communicate that the company cares about sustainability issues, that it has this specific board committee comprised of non-executive directors. As well, you could suggest that it's great for reviewing reports, because these are independent non-executive directors. They should be able to give an independent assessment of things like sustainability reports. So that increases the credibility of those reports. However, in the case of Rhodamine, it may be the case that the non-executive directors may be already engaged with other companies, and they may not have the capacity to sit on additional committees. So we may need to have more non-executive directors, which isn't necessarily a big problem, because the cost of non-executive directors is pretty low. Okay, they're not remunerated in a big massive pay package like you have with executive directors, and of course we need to have those additional 2 directors to bring that balance up. Okay, acquisition issues. So you can have situations where possibly we acquire a business, and then there's acquisition specific issues for governance. So when we acquire a business, should we take the directors from that business and put them on the group board? That's an interesting question, because sometimes it's a good idea because we're showing representation for that company that we've just purchased that should help with integration issues. But then when we think about it, if we're appointing that director, they may have a lack of independence in terms of their decision making. So even if they're an executive director, they may unnecessarily advocate for that subsidiary because they work for the subsidiary. So that might be a problem. As well, sometimes there may not necessarily be a role for them. So in the case of, let's say, a CEO, and we appoint that CEO to the board, you can't have 2 CEOs. So what are they going to do on the board? We need to create a department for them. So control environment. Now, this has not come up much, really, to be honest with you, but it is something just to be aware of because it came up recently, and it's one that students tend to be pretty poorly prepared for. Okay, so control environment is basically the attitude towards controls in a business. So it's an intangible factor, okay, and it basically sets the foundation for internal control. So if you have a weak control environment, chances are you're going to have problems in terms of risk, okay? So evaluating the control environment, you may be given a question about evaluating control weaknesses. This came up recently where basically you were given a situation where the business probably wasn't doing a fantastic job in terms of the controls that they had, and you had to highlight why those controls were weak. And this again is very scenario specific, so I can't really go too far into it, but basically you would just evaluate the controls that they had and kind of say, well, this is weak. For example, if we had, let's say, passwords being written on a post-it note on the laptop, that's pretty poor in terms of control weaknesses. So impact on the control environment. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this in core activity D. What we're talking about here is what impact could certain decisions have on the control environment. So if, for example, we have the dismissal of a director, how would that affect the control environment? Okay, so you could say, well, if the director has been dismissed because they bribed a government official, that's probably going to improve the control environment because that's going to show that we care about things like laws and ethics. But again, having a director gone for a sustained period of time reduces oversight, and that then can actually deteriorate the control environment over time. Next then is improving the control environment. So you may have a question about possibly making recommendations to improve the control environment. So that could be things like adhering to laws, adhering to ethics, possibly having policies on specific issues, publishing those policies, having communication with, let's say, the mines that we have, so showing that we care about things like controls, that we're actively reviewing events in those mines, and that we're actually looking at the controls, whether they're being adhered to. What challenges can we have? So let's say, for example, we have a mine and the control environment in the mine is not so good. What challenges could we have in improving the control environment? Maybe there's cultural issues, so we're in a high-risk country, possibly the staff are not being paid that much, they don't really care as much. Maybe there's a lack of oversight, there's a lack of supervision. In some cases, not the case for Rhodamine, but you could have maybe a lack of resources. It's a very niche situation where we can't actually create controls for whatever reason. Okay, so that can happen. But basically things like communication. So if there's maybe resentment from that mine, maybe we've just purchased the mine and actually we've made a load of staff redundant. Are those remaining staff going to really abide by everything that the board says from the Rhoda Mine Group office? Probably not. They're probably going to resent them. So that's going to be a challenge in improving the control environment. So let's look at some potential questions here. So with internal audit, you could have a question that says, evaluate the pros and cons or the arguments for and against having internal audit review sustainability reports. This came up before for Hot Air, which was a company about heat pumps. And actually, this is quite a good question. You could have a similar type situation. Actually, reviewing the integrated report is another kind of swap out for this. What are the benefits? Well, I suppose it adds credibility, right? They have the skills to do it. But the cons is that they may not necessarily have the exact technical expertise in regards to sustainability. So it may not be a perfect review. And as well, it may actually put pressure on the audit plan. Okay, so we talked about those points that you can put in. Recommend how internal audit might ensure new safety protocols are effective. So we talked about the various different, jobs that a kind of an internal auditor would do: checking, reviewing, interviewing, those types of things. Evaluate the value of an internal audit investigation into a safety incident. So basically, let's say a safety incident occurred and we're asked this question, what's the value in carrying out this investigation? Okay, so it's a good question, actually. What's the point? If we already kind of know, this person was injured, let's say, for example, they tripped, okay, and as a result, they had an injury. What's the point in carrying out this investigation? What's the value? So you could say, well, actually, there isn't a value. Maybe it's not really worth it because we already have a kind of preliminary idea as to what happened. Maybe it is a good idea because we may need to carry out this investigation as part of maybe a court case. It might sort of help us out in that regard. You could have a situation where it's a good idea because we're looking into whether the controls were effective in that particular situation, so it prevents the reoccurrence of that event. So those are answers you could give. The next then, so corporate governance. So evaluate the pros and cons of establishing a sustainability committee. So we talked about this already. Evaluate whether a non-executive with cyber experience should be appointed. We actually talked about this one already. Evaluate the pros and cons of appointing an acquisitions directors to the board. So we already talked about this one. Control environment. So evaluate the effect of a director's dismissal and what that would have on the control environment. We talked about this, but try to think about different events. So director's dismissal is kind of niche, okay? But let's say, taking on board members from a company that we just acquired, what effect would that have on the control environment? Think about other factors that you could have here. Evaluate the challenges in establishing a robust control environment in a new mine. Discuss that. Recommend how a mine's control environment might be improved. So we actually talked about that as well. So let's go through this example, and this is a really good one, okay? So this is valuable if you maybe are struggling with this topic. So Rhoda Mine's team of geologists recently discovered a very large commercially viable reserve of lithium in Darlan, which is a fictional country. The geologists, with assistance from other staff, performed a series of tests to confirm that the site is commercially viable, and the information has been placed in a report. The board wished to keep the findings of the report confidential for a limited time, as they are concerned that the release of this information now may depress lithium prices, which are currently higher than average. So remember that Rhoda Mine is a big business in the lithium space. So the release of this information could actually affect the pricing of lithium, because if we know that there's more reserves out there, that increases the supply, and naturally that's going to have an effect on the pricing. So this is the question. That's a big one. It's worth 60%. So recommend the work internal audit might undertake to keep the contents of the discovery report confidential, and explain the role the audit committee will have in regards to this work. So it's a two-parter. So the marking grids likely would be split in half in this case. So the first half would be the work that internal audit might undertake, and then the next is the audit committee piece. Okay, so this is worth 60%. So what we're going to do here, very simple, 6 paragraphs. Okay, so 10%, as we said, we should have 1 paragraph. And we're going to split it in 2. So we're going to have 3 paragraphs in the first part and 3 paragraphs in the second part. So IA, this is internal audit, the work that they're performing, employee exposure. So the first thing that they should do is basically determine the staff members who are exposed to the finding of the report. So again, it's the checking rule. They're checking to see who has been exposed to this information. So what they would do is they would trace the discovery process. So go through the entire discovery process for that lithium and see who knows about this information, and basically put together a list of all those employees. And then what we're doing here to enhance our answer is saying, well, what internal audit should do is they should recommend this particular course of action, which internal audit would typically do. They'd carry out an investigation and then make a recommendation. So their recommendation should probably be to give these staff a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, in return for maybe a bonus or something. Okay, so basically they sign a piece of paper that say, we're not going to talk about that, and if we do, we can be sued. Okay. The next then is the report's access. So basically internal audit should investigate the ways in which the report can be accessed. Okay, so if there's any paper copies, they should assess how this can be accessed. Okay, so maybe there's a paper copy in someone's drawer, maybe there's a, maybe one on a boat or something like that. So we need to make sure that we have an idea as to where these are, because the contents, we're trying to keep them confidential. The next then is, assuming there's digital copies, they should investigate where all those copies are located. That's much easier to do if we're able to look at the system as a whole. Okay, and we can go through the logs, we can actually see where that report is located. And again, going back to the role of internal audit, what work would they do? Okay, so this is not about having just a recommendation at the end, because that's the format that we should have. We're talking about the work that internal audit would do. They would recommend things that the business should do. So in this case, they're probably going to recommend to keep the digital copies in one central area that requires a password to access, and then they're likely to request that the paper copies be destroyed because they're harder to maintain within the business. Okay, so the confidentiality could be leaked just by accident. If someone had it on a table or something like that, you could see it. So the next thing is controls. So think about what the work that internal audit do. They test controls. So they might test controls that Rotomine has, possibly to prevent the leakage of confidential information in general. So for example, if we have controls like password protection for file drives, these particular controls would be important in this case. So if we're putting the report into a central location, we need to make sure that and I know it seems like common sense, but this is actually what an internal auditor would do, right? They would test to see, does that password control actually work? So they would type in the correct password. Does it work? Yes. They type in a bunch of rubbish, and if it actually lets us in, then we know that control is not good. Okay. You can go beyond this, so you can talk about the fact there would be other controls. Of course, this is just an example that they would test to ensure that the information that's there is kept secure. Okay. So the audit committee. So this is one that I could see students doing pretty badly on, because the audit committee is a little bit of a mystery, I suppose, because it hasn't been tested loads. So what would they do? They'd set the objectives. Okay, so we're talking here about the precinct. So the head of the internal audit department, they report to the convener of the audit committee. Okay, so in this instance, the audit committee's first role really is to establish the objectives of the work that's being performed. And what they would do is they would actually narrow down the scope. So the question kind of says, recommend the work that would be undertaken to keep the contents of the discovery report confidential. What the audit committee would do is they'd create an objective that says this specific information needs to be kept confidential, because it's quite general at the moment. Okay. The next then, the audit committee would determine if the audit work in general is worthwhile carrying out. Okay, so do we carry out this work? It may be the case that they make a determination that says, well, actually, because there's so many people involved in this discovery process, there's other parties involved, suppliers and customers, that actually it may be not worthwhile. Okay, so they would make that call. And that's a really high level answer. Okay. The next then, audit committee, the planning. So the audit committee would likely approve any planning that they have in terms of the annual audit work plan. This ad hoc work is very unlikely to be on the annual work plan, because it seems like they've just made this discovery. Therefore, the audit committee would need to determine the resources that need to be allocated to this work, okay, in order to kind of make everything flow with the annual audit work plan, and as well this ad hoc piece of work. So likely it's the case that they would set a deadline for this work to be completed by, in order to kind of capacity plan. So they would set a deadline, and that deadline then kind of says to the head of internal audit, okay, if the deadline is really short, this isn't a hugely important task that I need to allocate loads of resources to. Okay. The next then is follow-on action or follow-up action. So once the work's complete, the head of internal audit is likely to debrief the audit committee, and the internal audit report may be created to kind of capture and log the work that's been performed. Chances are, it's going to be created, and this would be debriefed, as we said, by the head of internal audit, the audit committee. The report itself would give the audit committee kind of an idea as to what happened with the work, and the audit committee would then review the work against the objectives that were set initially, and from here then the audit committee makes a determination as to whether more work should be performed, or maybe this is sufficient. They would just say, okay, that's fine. Okay, so that's really the work that would be performed. It's pretty straightforward in terms of the work that's done and the audit committee. Okay, so the audit committee again has that kind of overseer role, that kind of management role. Whereas the internal audit department, what are they doing? They're checking, reviewing, evaluating, interviewing, those kind of things. So that pretty much wraps up this session. So I just want to have a look. There's a few questions in here. And please put in your questions. Okay, so this basically wraps up the session. So we'll just stay on until you have your questions effectively answered. So keep going with your questions if you want the session to continue. Okay, so I'm here for a little bit more. So the question here is, would we be penalized if we take current events into the case study? You wouldn't be penalized, so to speak, but you probably wouldn't get marks to answer your question kind of directly. It depends on the way in which you've incorporated. So let's say, for example, you say, let's say, for example, a share repurchase, that question is examined. It says, evaluate the arguments for and against engaging in a share repurchase program. Okay, let's say you get that. You could say in your answer, and this would be the incorporation of real world information that would likely get you marks. You could say, well, if we were to keep the funds in our bank account and not use them for this share repurchase program, there's a risk because inflation is so high that actually we're going to deteriorate the value of that cash. Okay, so that's kind of like, I suppose, a small way in which we could incorporate real world information that would be valid, because even if inflation isn't high, the fact that we have inflation means that if you keep the money in the bank, that it's probably not going to earn like a huge amount. Okay, so possibly it's a better idea to use these funds for a share repurchase program. So that would be maybe a good example of using real world information that might get you marks. But generally speaking, it's not going to get you marks. Okay, so if you say, for example, this company did this in the real world, therefore Rodomine should do it, it's probably not going to get you marks, to be honest. Sammy, nice to see you, Sammy. Desley D, are committee members paid? Yeah, they are. So normally what happens in the real world is if you're a non-executive director, you normally get a flat fee, and that flat fee is normally paid based on the amount of meetings you attend. Different companies do different ways. Normally you're paid for your time, so you're given like a flat fee, let's say, I don't know, £5,000 or something per meeting you attend, and then you get a premium for being on different committees and stuff. It's normally a flat fee, but yeah, committee members are paid because they're non-executive directors. Hema, no problem at all. Thank you so much for the session. Are you planning to take a few more sessions in the early weeks? If yes, can we have a little early, as India it's midnight? Well, thank you so much for attending. If it is midnight, I really appreciate it. It's pretty late here too. I am planning anything at the moment, but I appreciate the point. And you know what? If you have any feedback on what you would like to see, then please email me. So it's hugh@proaccountancy.com. I appreciate time zones. So this is why with my course, a lot of the stuff is on demand, because time zones are just impossible to get right. We have students in Saudi Arabia, we have students in Oman, we have students in Australia, we have students in the Cayman Islands, we have students in Ireland, UK. So it's hard to kind of get the time zones 100%. But I suppose it's better have a live session than not. You know what I mean? Stefano, so do you think game theory is possibly examined for this case study? So I know where your question is coming from, because game theory was tested in a semi-recent case study, and the reason why it was tested is because in that pre-scene there was a article on game theory, and it was to do with, it was like game theory was being applied to supermarkets. And I think Cima were kind of giving a hint. They were saying, look, this could be tested. So they put it in the pre-scene. So it wasn't so much of a surprise for the students who were sitting the paper. But now looking back, if you didn't know that, you would say, oh, it just kind of came out of nowhere. Could it be tested? Yeah, it could be tested. Just to be honest with you, it's on the syllabus. It was answered really poorly on the day. And when I say that, I'm saying that because, obviously the examiner wants to retest things that were answered poorly, because they want to make sure that students have a full breadth of knowledge. Because what's Cima doing at this level? They're saying, well, if you pass this exam, you're effectively a finance professional. So they want to make sure that you understand the full syllabus. So it could be tested. I don't really personally, I don't think it's highly likely, but yeah, it could be. I mean, it's not the hardest topic. It probably is just hard for a lot of people because it hasn't really been tested loads, and its application is not perfect in kind of modern business environments. So game theory is basically about like reactions. Okay, so what reaction do we have if a competitor does X? Should we do Y? And I suppose the questions that could come up about it is like, how do we apply game theory to this decision? So let's say, for example, we have a company and maybe they purchase AI software that discovers lithium reserves, and possibly then we have a question about game theory. Should we do similar? That type of thing. that could maybe be tested. And again, I'm kind of just ranting on a bit, but yeah, I suppose to answer your question, it could be. And please, ask more questions, guys, because I'm here for, I don't even know what time it is, but yeah, I'm here for a bit more time. But if there's no questions, I will just leave and have my dinner. So, what advantages do you think a creation of an ethics committee would add to the board? That's a good question. I suppose, generally speaking, if you have an ethics committee, it signals to the markets that you take ethics seriously. So if you had maybe a controversy, it's maybe a way to respond to that. So if we had bribery or something like that happening with the business, it's a way to say, actually, we're trying to take action to resolve this issue. Or it just, if we had no controversy, is to say, yeah, we take ethics super seriously, which obviously markets and shareholders are going to want to see, because ethical principles mean that their wealth is protected to a certain extent. Okay, so that's a good thing for them. The other benefit is that it creates more discussion around ethics on the board, so it should help in kind of acting in alignment with ethics. Okay, so that's a good thing. In terms of the drawbacks, can kind of slow down decision making. So if you have a committee that's there reviewing every decision that we're making and seeing is in alignment with the code of ethics, it's going to slow things down, isn't it? So I suppose that's a drawback. And another drawback is that you have to get more non-executive directors on the board, really, to kind of fill that committee up, because if you look at the existing members, chances are a lot of these people that work as non-executive directors are on multiple boards. Normally they're retired. They don't always sit in loads of committees. So if you look at real companies, they tend to just have more non-executives if they want to fill up those committees. Okay, so any other questions, guys, please? And just to note, right, so I'm not like a shopping channel here, but if you want more information, please do look at my website, proaccountancy.com. I believe I have the best course in the market. I've worked for multiple tuition providers, and multiple providers have used my content, and you may not even know it was my content. My content's used on the FLP. If you look at the introduction to the SCS, the MCS, the OCS, you'll see my lessons. So if you want to see more from me, then purchase. Maybe my textbook is pretty good, I would say. If you're looking for marking services, please contact me directly, because we are working on a product, but it requires a bit of work to create on the website, and I have to basically put in a manual sale for it. So it's something that I have to do on a case by case basis. And if you're looking for the course, you get direct access to me, and you get all these amazing lessons, plus mocks, plus assessment sets, plus feedback from me. And it's probably the best way of just kind of like having someone there that you can ask. Okay, so everyone wants AI, ChatGPT, whatever, but it's like I'd rather have someone who's gone through the exam, has taught thousands of people. It just makes sense. Okay, so if you're interested, please do look at the website, and be happy to help you out. Hugh@proaccountancy.com, by the way, is my email. If you want to contact me directly, talk to me about how I could help you. I don't do coaching or anything like that, but with the course, you have my WhatsApp, and I contact people daily, and I make sure everyone is going through the program, and I make sure people that maybe are a bit nervous about the exam that I'm there for them. Okay, so student success is super important to me. I've never just said, I'm going to sell a course and let people go and just do whatever they want. I try to make sure that people like pass the exam. It's really, really, really important to me. So that's, I suppose, my sales pitch to you. Okay, so because I suppose with some of these webinars, sometimes tuition providers put on webinars, and what are they? They're basically a big advertisement. So this has been basically 3 hours of me and 2 minutes of promo. So Desley, Alex. Sorry, Mohammed. Okay, so there's a good few questions here. So, any chance of scenario planning and stress testing? Please explain technique for handling this question. Well, Mohammed, it depends on the way in which it's been tested. So, could scenario planning be tested? Yes, definitely it could be tested. Typically, scenario planning questions will come up in two ways. The first would be where you're given a series of scenarios and you have to evaluate those scenarios. So how will they play out? If you're given that question, really what you need to think about are the consequences, the long-term consequences of those particular events. So if there's, let's say, for example, a ransomware attack, this has come up before, you need to think about, let's say one of those courses of action is that the ransomware is activated and all the files are encrypted. That's going to affect reputation. It's going to be a financial effect on the business. If it's the case that actually we pay them a fee, the hackers a fee, and then they release the files, well, that's going to be kind of a problem from a legal perspective, because we may be paying hackers. That could be illegal in some countries. And as well, it may be a problem from a market perspective, because we may be making a big payment for effectively nothing. And, there's other issues as well to consider. Okay, so yes, we have, decrypted the files, but, there could be privacy issues. So the fact that they were encrypted in the first place by hackers could suggest that maybe they have actually been leaked. Okay, so would you trust a hacker? Probably not. The other way in which scenario planning can be tested is how to put together one. So basically what you need to do with that is you need to kind of look at high uncertainty factors, group them together, and then run those scenarios. So basically, like, think about the different scenarios that could happen with those different factors. And then you need to address how you would react to those factors. Okay, so let's say, for example, we have, high interest rates as a potential scenario or a factor. And maybe we've grouped in high interest rates, high inflation. Okay, so how would we react to that as a business? Okay, so maybe we would take on less debt. Okay, so that's just kind of an example of that. If there's more inflation, we might need to possibly look at diversifying. So maybe moving into something like sodium, which is cheaper. Okay, so it's cheaper to mine and cheaper to sell. Okay, so possibly then that creates a market for sodium ion batteries because they tend to be cheaper to produce. Well, not necessarily because they're an experimental technology. I suppose they're expensive, but in the long run they should be cheaper because sodium is a cheaper resource. Alex, so in the pre-scene it says how the chief internal audit reports to the convener of the audit committee. Who is this? That's a good question. Yeah, we don't know, but basically what they're saying is that the internal audit department reports into the audit committee. It's a fancy way of saying that, but yeah, we don't really know. We don't have that detail. Desley, so what does one do if they don't know how to answer a question at all? Leave it blank. No, never, ever, ever, ever leave a question blank. Never do that. Because if you put in nothing, you will get nothing. Even if you put in, random points, there's a probability you might get like 1 or 2 marks, right? So what I would suggest is if you're really stuck, right, you're in an emergency situation, just put in something, okay? It doesn't matter what it is. As much as possible, put something in. Please don't leave something blank. Even if you feel stupid writing what you're writing, the marker might just give you a mark or 2. And we have had students, like I've had students in previous companies that have failed by 1 mark. So don't let that be you, okay? So if you fail by 1 mark, you'd be thinking to yourself, I could have just written something in the answer box, okay? So anything. First thing that comes to mind with the topic, because often it's the case. So let's say, for example, there was a question that came up on political risks, and the marking grid said, explained political risk as a kind of thing, right? Defined it effectively. So if you saw political risk and you just defined it, you probably know what that is, then you would have got probably 2 or 3 marks, okay? So in that case, so it does really pay to just put something in, okay? Now I know you're talking about an emergency situation, an unfortunate situation where you just don't have the knowledge. Ideally you would have the knowledge, obviously, but like you're talking about something that is realistic, and thanks for bringing it up. Never ever ever leave it blank. That's probably my number 1 advice to everyone. Don't, because you get 0, okay? And there's no point. You might as well put something in and just chance getting a mark or 2. You never know, it could be the difference between passing and failing. Okay, so we have a question here. Yeah, if there is a theory-specific question, for example, changing to residual dividend policy, and we couldn't remember the theory, how many marks could we get with generic responses? That's a really good question. Generally speaking, right, generic responses fit in the level 1 category. So Cima are conscious that sometimes students who don't have, that kind of advanced knowledge or like good level of knowledge, what they will do is they will basically give you what's known as a level 1 answer. So level 1 answer is where you just kind of define technical terms or just give a basic understanding of, as you said there, a residual dividend policy, right? So that would get you between probably 1 to about 4 marks. So hopefully that answers your question. For one piece of the marking grid, so let's say, for example, the marking grid split in 2 and you did it twice, you might get 4, 2 and 2, something like that. So between, for each trait, so you'll notice within the marking grids, they're split up into what's known as traits. You have a maximum of 4, typically you have a minimum of 2. This isn't written anywhere, okay, but you tend to see that if you look at the past papers. And, if you look at level 1 answers, they're normally like define or explains this term. And explain and define are very low level verbs at this SES level. So SES is all about, recommend, evaluate. They're what's known as high level verbs because they take a lot of considerations into account. So, define is something that you would typically see at OCS, explain is something you'd see at OCS, whereas recommend and evaluate is something that you would see at the SCS. So if you want to get top level answers, you evaluate, you recommend, whatever. Those are the verbs that are used in the questions. But if you just explain the theory, you will get like a mark or two, okay? Maybe sometimes even 3, okay? So hopefully that answers your question. How do we get more marks? That's a good question. I recommend buying my courses, probably the best way, because I have a lot of strategies for getting marks. But you know what? The best way to get marks, if I'm just to answer your question directly, is first of all, always make sure that you're answering the question directly. If you've been asked a question on, in this case, let's say the work that internal audit perform, as well as the role of the audit committee, make sure that you answer the question directly, that you answer both. Okay, so if you had just answered one piece there, you would maybe misread the question, maybe you just looked at the audit committee, you would have missed out on 50% of the marks, and that is so common. Okay, so please read the question really carefully, answer the question directly. Number one mistake made by students, okay, brought up by the examiner all the time. So that's the number one thing. The second thing is try to have structured paragraphs like we talked about, okay? So we said, we have a paragraph, we have lots of detail in it. That's what the examiner has said in their reports that they want to see. So do that, okay? So, I'm just taking what they say and I'm giving it to you, okay? So the reports are ginormous, they're ultra boring as well. So I have taken the task of going through them for you. And again, this information might be useful to you. So that's another thing. Answer the question directly and have a structure like we had there with the paragraphs where you're adding detail. If you want to get a level 3 answer, you'll always see in the marking grids they say with detail, with justification, with detail, with justification. That's what gets you the top level marks. Okay. Kelly, so nice to see you, Kelly. Hope you're doing well. Concealing findings to affect prices. What if Rhodomine was to potentially come together with another lithium company to slow extraction to influence prices? When does it become unethical? Oh, that's a good question. Well, it depends on the Cima code of ethics, as they say. So, in terms of integrity, it's unlikely that they would disclose that they're doing this, so it likely would break integrity, so it's not being honest. In terms of objectivity, it probably is in alignment with objectivity because it would actually increase profits, which is what the board is there to do. In terms of professional behavior, it's likely illegal because it is maybe violating antitrust laws. So collusion and or corporate collusion is often illegal, and things like this, like they call it antitrust law. You can violate antitrust law if you have a big organization. So it actually says in the pre-scene, and this would be a good application in pre-scene, that there's basically 4 big lithium mining companies. So if we're teaming up with another lithium mining company, we would have maybe an unfair competition case there because it's not like 2 small companies just kind of working together. It's like 2 ginormous companies colluding. So you could have maybe a breach of professional behavior. I don't think confidentiality would come into it, so hopefully that helps. Josh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And it's been a huge pleasure to be on the stream. This is the first ever live stream for Cima Tuition, okay? So lots of things is a first for that I did that other companies have ran with, but this is a first. So expect other tuition providers to do it. Sammy, okay, so please, is it likely we could have questions on derivatives as a means of mitigating future price risk? Possible scenario, if any? Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? Like, because it's in the pre-scene, isn't it? This sort of commodities exchange. Is it going to come up? I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I think you could maybe have one question on it. How could we use it, or what effects a certain, maybe a certain proposal could have on. Lithium pricing and the futures market. But, what I would suggest here is that this is a commodities future, okay? So commodities future, it's pretty straightforward, okay? It's not like currency or interest rates. It is to a certain extent, but it's a lot more straightforward. So, questions that could be on it, maybe the effects that something could have on it. So maybe like a global issue, again, maybe an increase in interest rates. How would that affect commodities exchange, but you're just talking about pricing, you know what I mean? When it comes down to it, that's really what it boils down to, isn't it? It's just a way of fixing prices. So that's really what we're thinking about, you know what I mean? Hopefully that answers your question, Sammy. Effectively what I'm saying is, yeah, it could be tested. I don't really know how. I know in the FLP there's I think there's a question on it. I'm not 100% certain. I think so. I don't know, but I'm not in the FLP. But I think there's a question on that. And how likely is it to come up? I don't know. Like, how could it be tested really when you think about it, right? So, if you think about the different core activities that we went through, you know, how does a commodities exchange? The commodities exchanges are not really a testable theory within the Cima curriculum. But maybe you could have a question, as I said, on the effects that a certain event would have on that commodities exchange, which is more about external environment analysis, you know, that kind of stuff, which fits within core activity B. So that's how I would see it being tested, Sam, if I'm being honest. Any more questions, guys? I see people we're down to 40 people. It's still huge, you know. Sometimes you see webinars with like 10 people. We've had like 50, 60, which is really good, to be honest, because the live stream, you know, people drop in, they drop out, whatever, which is excellent. So I'm really happy, and thank you so much, guys, for turning up. Desley, so does the format count for mark at least? No, you get absolutely nothing. It's ruthless, isn't it? Yeah, it used to be the case years ago with Cima that you did get marks for things like formats and kind of soft skills and things like that. You don't really get it anymore. It's not really a factor. For ACCA it is. So if you sit your ACCA exams, you do get marks for formatting in some exams, not for Cima exams. Okay, so your format, what I would suggest with your format, really simple. Here's the information you've requested, your heading that says A, B, whatever it is, A, ecosystems, and then your paragraphs underneath. Okay, and try to have subheadings as much as possible. That's really all you need to do, and kind regards or thanks. That's what I recommend my students do. If you do my course, you see I talk about this. I say it's a waste of time. You know, this is like how you know a tuition provider is good or bad, is if they tell you to put in a big introduction and conclusion, they likely haven't a clue what they're talking about. Okay, so if someone has told you to do that, don't do that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Peter, yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying that. It means a lot. And I do mean that, because I get lots of nice emails from people, and it's a big boost, isn't it? You know, so it's a lot of work sometimes, this prep stuff, you know what I mean? And prep for the case study, you can probably tell I'm exhausted. So, you know, it does mean a lot. Your kind comments mean a lot. So thank you so much. Sammy, how do we build smart answer points? Again, you know, what I would say is one paragraph for every 10%. That's a great way of doing it. And then what you do is you come up with headings. So you come up with keywords that represent the paragraphs you're about to write. So let's say, for example, you know, we're talking about the question about the audit committee, the type of work that the internal audit department does. We put up headings that represent the various different points we're about to work. So we're about to write. So let's say with the audit committee, we say, right, they need to set objectives. Okay, so that's the first thing. Planning was the next keyword, and then the next one was follow-on action. So I would just have those, and then I would write underneath them. And that's how I've been doing it for years. Okay, so that's how I did it for my own solutions, for other companies, for the FLP, before that changed. Okay, so that changed a few years ago. So that's how I write official answers, and it's how I wrote my own answers for my own Cima exams, which I won a prize. I think I won a prize for the OCS many years ago. So well done to me. Okay, so the next question there. Oh, thanks so much. It was really nice. Thanks. Really appreciate it. This question has motivated me. Thanks. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks for taking the time. Appreciate that. Thanks, guys. Okay, so since there is serious volatility in prices of lithium, what can Ronomine do in terms of slight price differentiation? How does it diversify to improve on its high beta? So there's multiple questions there. You might be able to hear my dog is actually snoring in the background. So volatility in prices. So what can we do in terms of price differentiation? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Okay, so try to explain to me. So what do you mean in terms of serious volatility in terms of slight price differentiation? I'm not 100% certain what you're referring to. Okay, trying to just give me some additional information there. The next thing is, how does it diversify to improve on its high beta? So if you want to reduce the beta, what it would need to do is reduce the amount of debt in its capital structure. That would probably be the biggest thing. So financial risk is a component of a levered beta. So you would need to reduce the amount of debt in the capital structure. So they can do that by repaying debt or increasing the amount of equity in its capital structure. So it could engage in a rights issue, or it could issue more shares, or it could have a follow-on offering or something like that. So that's something it could do. And it could also purchase a business that has business risk lower than what it has. Okay, so a factor of beta is business risk, And that business risk is actually measured in what's known as the unlevered beta. And that unlevered beta, if it's lower than Rhodomine's unlevered beta, then on average it will reduce the overall beta. So basically investing in a business that has lower business risk, its operations has a lower amount of risk than Rhodomine. So that's how it would reduce its beta. Stefano, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Magic, it depends. So there's a good question about the recording, right? I just want to check and see what the quality looks like. The quality could look terrible. Okay, so I want to make sure. And I also want to make sure I didn't say anything that I shouldn't have said. Okay, so when I just have a quick look at it before make a decision whether to upload it. I think I will upload it. Okay, so I think it went pretty well. I don't know, do you guys think it has much replay value? The fact that my voice has gone multiple times in it, probably not amazing, not the best, but it is live, isn't it? So, you know, it's not like the videos that I have in my course. These are all like professionally recorded. This is me in, you know, a room with my dog in the background and whatever. So it's not 100% perfect. Would you like to see it on YouTube? I mean, that's a question. Okay, so that's my question to you. Sammy, yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it, guys. It means a lot to me. You know, it's a tough industry. You know, it's very hard to compete because there's so many tuition providers these days. You know, when I was a student, there was just a few. There was like 4 or 5, and you know, one or two of them were just like, you know, you wouldn't bother using them. But it's different now. There's lots. Okay, Desley, will subscribing to the channel help you in the future to show appreciate? Yeah, 100%. I really appreciate that. Yeah, 100%. And you know what? The thing is like, I'm trying to think about, you know, post qualification topics to talk about as well, Desley. So, you know, there are a lot of things that, for example, Cima students, when they finish their qualification, they have a lot of questions about what comes next, and what comes after. So you know, maybe I might look at that. So yeah, sure, subscribe, and you know, we may have some interesting topics to talk about, and you never know, right? I'd love to interview a prize winner. Okay, so like the modern day, you know, first place prize winner. What did you do? So hopefully that's one of you guys. Okay, so I would appreciate if you could win a prize and get in touch with me. That would be a great interview, and we could put that up on the YouTube channel. I'd love to do that. Or someone who has failed the exam loads. I'd love to talk to someone who, like, there was someone that reached out to me recently. They failed the exam 10 times. I'd love to see, you know, what made them pass the 11th time. Okay, you know, so that's something that I'm looking to do on the YouTube as well. Magic, definitely put it on. Stefan, I hope your dog isn't too upset. No, he's perfectly fine. He's just really sleepy, and he's a loud sleeper. He's like, you know, you can kind of hear him in the background. But you know what? It's pretty funny actually. You can see him like shaking and stuff. So, it's pretty funny. Magic, definitely put it on YouTube. Seen the second half only, and it's great. Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that. 10, my notes aren't the clearest, so watching it over will help a lot. Okay, perfect. Oh, well, that's good to know. Okay, I appreciate that. Mohammed, next session, date and time. I don't know, to be honest with you. It's going to be for the February window, I'd imagine. I think it was a little bit late with the November window, but for the February window, I don't know. You know what I mean? I'm not sure. Maybe December. I think at some point in December, to answer your question, Mohammed. We'll see. Not 100% sure yet. So again, if any of you are looking for help with your exam, you know, there's the first ever textbook for this subject was written by myself. It's 480 pages, gives you 20 questions and answers at the end, which is probably what most people are looking for, is, you know, questions written specifically for Rhodomine, which is super important. You get that exposure. If you're looking for that textbook, it's €99. It's like the cheapest way to pass your exam. If you're looking for something that's the full package, it's pretty good, to be honest with you. If you're looking for more help, you're looking for more of a personal touch, the course that I sell, I cannot stress enough, I believe it's the best in the market. Obviously I'm biased, but I believe it's got the most amount of interaction with someone who understands the exam, and the same for all the case study exams, to be honest with you. So if you're interested, please let me know. Go on the website proaccountancy.com, or email me at hugh@proaccountancy.com, and we can see, you know, how I could help you. Remember, it is a small business, right? So I can, we can come up with flexible offerings. Again, I was talking about the fact that mock marking, I would love to put it on the website, but it takes a bit of time to create a product properly. So I can create a custom product and come up with a proposition for you. So please do reach out to me. I may be able to help you. Even if you're looking to sit this exam in November, you think maybe I want to just try a few mock papers written by Hugh instead of someone else, then please reach out to me. I give a lot of detailed feedback. Don't shortchange people. This is my business, this is my reputation, so it's not in my interest to give you terrible feedback and just kind of pass you off and say, yeah, I'd love to take your money. For me, I live and die by my reputation, so at the end of the day, I'm going to give you detailed feedback and kind of feedback that will be useful to you in the exam, hopefully increase your marks going forwards. So is there any other questions, guys, just before I go? Okay, so if there's anything else that you guys have, then I'd be happy to answer. There's a bit of a delay on the stream, so it takes a while for your questions to come to me, which is why it probably looks a bit weird, me just looking at my screen. Fantastic revision. Well, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay. Guys, I think that's probably it. If there's no questions, that's totally fine. I can go about my day, and you guys can go about your studying and your exam. I just want to say before I do go, I wish you all the very best of luck with your exam, and I'm conscious of the fact that you're probably all, different providers, FLP, whatever. We have students from all over the world, and I really appreciate you taking the time to attend this session. I know it's been really long, but it's been really good for me to try something different. I'll be honest with you. I really wanted to do this when I worked in other businesses. I think live streaming is a really good way of people just being able to drop in and out of a session and not have to feel like they're signing up, all their emails, they're getting spammed every 5 seconds. It's a great way of just having a interaction with the person that they might want to purchase a course from. Okay, so you get a flavor for what you could get on a course with me, or maybe if you don't know me and maybe I've contacted you out of nowhere, now you know me a bit more. Okay, so guys, thank you so much. I think that's probably a good ending to all this, and I really wish you the best of luck with the SES. If you're in my WhatsApp group, I'll see you in probably a few minutes. Okay, so this is not the end necessarily. If you're not in the WhatsApp group, it was like 150 members in it, so please let me know, and I'll be happy to add you to it, and we can talk more about the SCS and share ideas, and just come up with strategies for passing the exam. So guys, look, I think that's probably it. I don't see any questions, so thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Live stream was really good attendance actually, and I really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for everything, and best of luck with your exams.